All right, hello everybody. Today we are continuing what Tripp and I started a couple days ago, talking about the conversation with Douglas Murray, Jonathan Pageau, and Jordan Peterson that came out on Jordan Peterson's channel a few days ago. We had so much to say, Tripp and I felt like we didn't really get very far, and we wanted to talk more, and Bethel wanted to talk too. And so here we are all having this conversation. I think people who have listened to my channel before will probably be familiar with all of us, but Tripp and Bethel, I'll start with you, Tripp. Do you want to introduce yourselves very quickly before we get going?
My name's Tripp. If you want to hear an intro, view Sam's previous video where I did way too much talking and introduced myself there. So I don't want to spend too much time.
Yeah, hey, I'm Bethel. I did an intro video with Paul and Sam some months back, and I've also done some conference stuff with Paul in Chicago that you can find. So I'm a writer. I have a math PhD I don't do anything with. I love philosophy. I love to talk. I tweet a lot. Follow me on Twitter if that's your sort of thing. So that's me.
And you, Bethel, have also talked with Douglas Murray. There's a conversation
I've also
between
talked
you
with
and
Douglas
him.
Murray. Douglas is a friend of mine. I have his email. I occasionally use it. I try not to abuse it. I even sent him rough embryonic thoughts of mine on this convo, and he was appreciative. So, yes, I don't know that I can call him a friend, but a warm acquaintance at least.
Well, that's cool. And I can say that I have shaken Jonathan Pageau's hand, and I'm sure he has no recollection of that. And
same for
that
me, Jordan Peterson. Yeah.
And that his hair has even more flow in person than it does on the internet, but he is a little shorter than you expect him to be. But I have never met Jordan Peterson. I've seen Jordan Peterson talk, book tour live, but I've never really met him.
Yep, same for me.
I have a picture of my wife and I and our 3-week-old second kid with Jordan Peterson.
Super cute.
We got to meet
Very
him
cute
after
story.
a talk and those kind of things. Yeah. So,
yeah.
So I met him. I know Jonathan a little bit better actually, and I actually have some of his artwork in our home. And but I've never actually met or spoken to Douglas Murray. But he is. I was telling Bethel before, he is the star of this conversation. Like, he is the one that I think largely drove it, and he is the one that made the most I think dense points in terms of content, which is why I think it was such good stuff.
Yeah, I think that Douglas is the most honest seeker. And the most articulate seeker, I think there are a lot of people Paul Vanderklay said this, and I think this is true, that Douglas represents a fair amount of people that we know that might have had an atheist or agnostic or non-Christian phase and are sort of coming around to reappreciate Christianity in some sense and the role it's played in their lives and their culture and stuff like that. But they can't quite fully become Christian themselves for reasons of some intellectual reservations and a couple other things like that.
I might refer a couple of times to things Douglas said in the convo we had because, Justin Brierly did the thing where he's what would it take for you or whatever, which Douglas is obviously uncomfortable with, but Justin was very charming and it pulled some cool stuff out of Douglas. So people want to go back and listen to that. I was still under my pen name, Esther O'Reilly. And there's some political stuff at the beginning. It now feels kind of dated because we recorded it in late 2019, which feels like a decade ago. But then towards the back half, we really dug in and got into some of this stuff. And you'll hear there's echoes. Douglas has really been saying a number of the same things for a few years. It's just, I think most people have thought of him as a political guy, primarily a pundit. But he's a lot deeper than that, has way more facets, and I've known this for a long time. So it's kind of fun for me. It's yay, everyone else is finally catching up to all the cool things about Douglas. So
yeah.
All right. With that said, let's play our first clip from the convo, and then we'll lead into talking about that.
to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but
for every 1 pound increase in mech strain.
All right, talk amongst yourselves.
YouTube ads.
Man, YouTube ads. I can see why Paul does
YouTube Premium. I do that too.
YouTube Premium.
I recommend.
I do it too. Like, I just get sick of the ads. Yeah, I can't do it.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to back up a little bit. Hopefully I don't get an ad. And I should splurge and invest in YouTube Premium. All right, here we go again.
by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the dialogue on religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. The tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story, in a certain sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is. In other words, they have to continue to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but is something which has a truth claim behind it. And then let me just say one other thing on that, which is this. The issue of unifying ethic, because it must be what we're sort of somehow also, among other things, as well as trying to define what the true is and what the real is, must be one of the things that we must sort of try to grapple towards. The issue on this seems to me to be, is the Christian ethic, the Christian tradition, to think of it in Hegelian terms, is it an exhausted force or an unexhausted force? This for our age seems to me to be one of the absolutely crucial issues to address. Is it exhausted or unexhausted?
Right. I have a few things to say.
Okay, so the obvious question to ask here is, what do we mean by exhausted? Now, I mean, I have kind of a cultural, sociocultural point to make here, which, Tripp, I don't know if this is a direction you were thinking about, but I mean, I think I would say, depending on the denomination or the region, you could say yes. I mean, you could say the main line is exhausted, the Church of England is exhausted, large swathes of Catholicism are exhausted, because of that whole tragedy of the clergy thing. So Richard Holloway is a big wig in this area, somebody who influenced Douglas and kind of embodied the priest who doesn't believe anything, right? So in those contexts, it's exhausted in the sense that the people who were supposed to steward it have failed. But of course, that doesn't reflect on the actual power of Scripture, the actual power of the ethic, the potency of the story, the reliability of the story, any of that. It's just a reflection of, how weak and vulnerable people can be to peer pressure and to the shifting winds of culture.
I think there's also an interesting sort of America versus Europe question on this, that obviously American Christianity does seem to be sort of on the decline, or at least sort of losing ground at the moment, but it still feels like it has a lot more strength left in it than maybe Christianity feels like in Europe. But there are weird ebbs and flows throughout Christian history of religiosity and revival and periods of kind of doubt or drought of strength of faith. Like, the lowest church attendance in national history was like the 1760s and 1770s, like right around the time of the Revolution. And like, I think a lot of people imagine the further back you go in time, the more religious everyone was, the more likely people were to go to church. But the most church attendance-y time of the United States history was the 1950s, right? Which many people alive can remember or grew up in. Like, it's sort of, the time when Jordan Peterson, he's maybe a little bit too young for that, but other people not much older than him would have remembered growing up in a very, adherent, at least by that metric, time. So I think that this idea that Christianity, started nascent emerged in power, peaked in like, I don't know, the Middle Ages or whenever you want to say it peaked, and has been, waning ever since then. That's not really quite the story, and it can vary from place to place. And if you were in Nigeria right now, the idea that Christianity is some spent force seems like, perfectly ridiculous.
Yeah, well, and I mean, Douglas and I covered this in our talk, but Douglas has been to Nigeria and written very potently about that, and even took something of a risk because they're under attack right now, and he was very deeply affected by that, and had this sort of wistful, it awoke that kind of longing in him that he couldn't join them, but he saw what they had. Another thing to your point too, Sam, about a mistaken history of these things, there's a similar kind of mistaken history around the whole subtraction story, which we don't need to play that whole clip, but the how in the 19th century all these things happened and then the tide began receding or whatever, when actually there was a wave of reconversions in that period. So I'm always plugging Timothy Larson's book, Crisis of Doubt, here, because it's about all these guys who they began as Christians, they went through a crisis of faith, they became sort of like the new atheists of their time. Some of them, they went on the lecture circuit giving atheist talks. Then they came back, they reevaluated the evidence, they reconverted it. Then they went back and became like, apologists and wrote all this great stuff. And there was a whole wave of that happening in the Victorian era, which nobody knows about. So, I mean, we could go on all day about that.
Yeah, I guess my take on this is that after Douglas said this, it reminded me of some readings that I had done a long time ago whenever I read Hegel, because I'm not a Hegel scholar. I know Aquinas. If you mention Aquinas or the Greek philosophers, I know them very, very well. Hegel is not someone that I'm an expert in. But whenever he referenced it struck something to me, and it reminded me of something. So I went down that rabbit hole over the last 24 hours to try and re-look at what it was that Hegel was saying and about forces and inexhausted forces and exhausted forces and everything else to try and understand what it was that Murray was trying to say here. And it was fascinating because I ended up reading a guy by the name, he's a French philosopher by the name of Gilles Deleuze. Deleuze, I think, is his name, and so he was a Hegel scholar and wrote a bunch and taught a bunch on Hegel and Heidegger and those kind of things, and the whole dialectic and everything else. But he had a quote kind of describing Hegel's philosophy, and it really struck me as in context what I think Douglas was trying to get at. And so his quote is, "It is an exhausted force which does not have the strength to affirm its difference. Mm-hmm. A force which no longer acts, but reacts to the forces that dominate it. Only such a force brings to the foreground the negative element in its relation to the other. Such a force denies all that it is not and makes this negation its own essence and the principle of its existence." And in the context of what Peterson and Pageau were saying, they were just reacting. Their whole thing was reacting to the criticisms of essentially the new atheist movement of well, but how could you believe that this was actually real or this was actually literal or this kind of thing. And so they're trying to say, well, don't worry about that. We're talking about truth in a different way, that kind of thing. It's a reactive narrative that they're giving, not an active one. And so what Douglas is begging for is an active narrative that actually pushes the affirmation of the Christian story forward. And so in the context of what Douglas is saying and the context in which he brings up, I think that's what he meant. Mm-hmm. It as at that very poignant point. And I think that Douglas, again, he's so he is so sharp and like his references are so like dense, I think that gets missed. But I think that is when he brings up the exhausted versus inexhaustive, and he mentions Hegel explicitly. That's what he's talking about. It's like, are you guys just trying to like kind of react? Is Christianity just like a resistive force here, or are you actually affirming something? Is this something that you're just like, you're going to explain Christianity in reaction to the scientific naturalistic narrative, or are you going to affirm Christianity as something more than that, that is inexhausted, that can actually move the conversation and our understanding of the world forward? Because like that's what he's looking for, and that's why he like later he talks about embracing the weird and everything else like that. Right. But I honestly think that is what he meant.
And I mean, I think that's what Pageau thinks he's doing. And I think Pageau, in his way, because when he talks about, there was this sort of telling bit where he talks about his conversion to orthodoxy. And he said, well, I became orthodox because it was just like ignoring it wasn't trying to set itself up against a scientific theory. It was its own way of doing Christianity, and that really attracted me to it. So, I mean, I think Pageau is going to try to say it's Protestant Reformation and following Christians, or post-Enlightenment Christians who are getting caught up in a reactionary cycle with the theist-atheist debates, and so then he's going to say, well, come be kind of woozy and orthodox like me, and you'll avoid all of that. But then I think what you see unfolding here is that that's not what Douglas is looking for either. So, I mean, it didn't land, I think. It didn't land the way they were thinking it would.
Yeah, and I think Pageau kind of felt that at a couple points. Like there's the part where he says, I mean, I know what you're asking, Douglas, right? You're asking, did he get out of the grave, right?
Do you want to play that? I mean, we could just go to that directly here.
I think so, right? That is on the forensics of the resurrection part, I think so, yeah. All right.
Is it the 4704 bit?
Yeah, I think so. All right.
Okay.
Here we go. Hopefully no ads.
I think Douglas, I understand your question. Like, I understand your question. The answer is the grave empty, something like that. Like, was the grave empty? And this is, I think, where maybe it's the most difficult for many materialists to understand. And I know that my ramblings about the glass and about the good and about this might seem like it's going all over the place. But it's actually supremely important to understand that if you change your perception about the manner in which the world exists, focused based on the idea of a good, of an ethic, that it's what underlies even the factuality of the world, then that which will convince me of the truth of the resurrection is not about a bunch of material facts. It's about the imposition of that story as being so real that it overwhelms everything else. And it shines a light on everything else. Through the image of the resurrection, we're able to see everything through it. And so if you ask me, like, what is the mechanical cause of the resurrection? Like, how is it that this body could have, I would say that is obfuscated not only in the text, but also in the creed. The reason why in the creed it says he rose again according to the scriptures is because nobody wanted to try to give you a mechanical description. And in the text itself, when the disciples encounter Christ, they don't even recognize him. What is going on there? They don't even know who he is.
Well, in the beginning.
All right.
Okay.
Let's respond to some of that. I mean, one thing that I think is interesting about Pageau's story that I didn't know, the one time I met him in person, he was in Chicago for some sort of Catholic art thingy. And he gave a talk saying, oh, it was good to be back in Chicago. I'm like, back? When? And he said that his dad got a PhD at Wheaton and that he lived, presumably somewhere out near Wheaton while that was happening, and that his parents were the sort of evangelicals, probably not too different from a lot of our upbringings, and that I think that Pageau knows intimately well that flavor of Christianity, and reacted against that sort of thing himself, but yet he can remember. And
Yeah.
when he's like, okay, Douglas, what you're asking is did he walk out of the tomb? But
Which is
now
a
let me
basic-
transition. Yeah.
But and I don't understand. I guess I don't understand why Jonathan seems so oddly squeamish. I mean, if he's watching this, I'm sorry. You know, he could defend himself later. But that was the word that kind of came to mind. Now, I do have a thought when he's using this phrase mechanical causes or mechanics. You can get into conversation with a certain kind of atheist, and this has happened to me, who will just keep like bullying and pushing you. But how? But how? How did Jesus rise from the dead? How did he turn water into wine? Give me a mechanism. I need like a mechanism here, mechanical cause. That's where you roll your eyes and go, please. Okay. Well, fine. You tell me, how does one electron repel another? Okay. That's how my dad always likes to answer that, because we can ask this question all day and we can get right down to the level of electrons repelling each other. At a certain point, it's just like things happen. I'm sorry. It's just so, if that's what he means by a mechanical cause or a mechanism, then I agree. But it sounds to me like he's kind of equivalating and smudging that together with the simple, basic, fundamental physical happeningness of Jesus rising again. I think it's later where he asks, did Jesus sit up in the grave? Well, we don't really know. That's not really. I'm like, why wouldn't Jesus have sat up in the grave? Why is this a problem? Why do we have to be strange and dodgy and squeamish about this? It's like, do we have a problem with that? And this whole notion of like, well, how ancient people thought, this is Jonathan's kind of version of that. It's that like, this isn't how the gospel writers would have been thinking, and we're trying to impose our modernist materialist understanding, yada, yada. Well, I mean, go look at that passage in the Gospel of John where the soldier pierces Jesus' side with a spear. And John, I mean, okay, it's a little third person, but I think this is really John telling us that he was there and he saw it happen. And it's this lovely line, and he that saw it bear record, and his record is true. And he knoweth that he saith true, that ye might believe. And it's in the context of this, very gritty, material, concrete thing of blood and water coming out of Jesus' side, which sure seems like he's asking for you to apply a forensic analysis, so to speak. And so, I'm sorry, but I don't think that the writers of the Gospels were really writing or thinking much differently from how we would write or think. I think it was reported to think they were trying to put together a reliable account of events. So that needs to be front loaded. That's the distinctness, the weirdness that we need to be really kind of shouting from the rooftops. And I think that Jonathan really makes a mistake in his priorities when he kind of pushes that to the back row. I mean, it's not that it isn't there, but he doesn't foreground it.
Yeah, I think there's a certain like attraction of like talking about Christianity the way that Jordan Peterson does or Pageau does to people, to like open them up to it, because like for people who might have come from like the new atheist movement or something like that, or have been influenced by that kind of thinking, to like talk about Christianity in a metaphorical sense about all the good that it does and the meaningfulness and that kind of stuff. At least like to soften like the hearts maybe of people who want, be like, okay, maybe actually like there's something that's not just purely like evil, like slavery in the Old Testament kind of Sam Harris.
The problem is that Douglas is already past that. He's not at that stage.
I agree. And so this is something that I mentioned to Sam earlier, is that I don't think that kind of representation of Christianity is going to so you've got someone from religion is all bad and we can get rid of it and reason is all we need and that kind of stuff, right? And so you've got that person. And so
which is where Douglas was. I mean, let's not forget, Douglas was a mentee of Christopher Hitchens back in the day.
Right, exactly.
So he had his angry young man phase, which he sort of outlines in the intro, but then he talks about how he mellowed and changed and got to where he is now. So
I think that like the Peterson Pageau kind of representation of Christianity can get people out of stage one new atheism into this kind of like Christian atheism that that Douglas is, and that kind of stuff. But I don't think you can get them beyond that.
Christianity.
Yes, I think that, but I don't think that you can get, I don't know that this is a good representation of Christianity to get Douglas out of that into like something more, because like at some point he's going to want to know, is the grave empty? Did Jesus actually get up and walk out of that grave? Did he actually did he actually eat the fish? Did he actually did Thomas actually touch the wounds? Like what is it that actually happened here? And so we can talk about, again, Bethel, you and I were kind of going back and forth on some of this stuff over email before this talk. I'm willing to say that there's some parts of scripture that have different genres. Like we talked about the poetry sections and various things like that. But the Gospels very much do read to me like a forensic, like an actual eyewitness, account of what actually happened. And so, and C.S. Lewis said the same. He's like, listen, I've been reading myth and mythology and allegory and all this kind of stuff all my life. That's not what whatever the Gospels are, that's not what they are. That's not what they were meant to be. And I completely agree with C.S. Lewis on that point. We can't just go with the Pageau, are there archetypes here? Yes. Of course there are archetypes here. Is there symbolic meaning behind all of this? Of course there is. Did it actually literally happen? And this is an eyewitness account? Well, yeah. I don't know how else you read this.
Right.
Except all of the above. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know what he's talking about when he says that we know in the Creed, when they say he rose again according to the scriptures, that was them being obfuscated because they didn't want to get into him. Like, what? Where's this coming from? That's nonsense.
Well, I don't even know. I don't know. His reading of that part of the Nicene Creed of he rose again according to the scriptures as being somehow minimizing, right? Of what the claims were. You're like, well, but the scriptures were pretty clear about what happened, right?
It's it's the same idea as behind 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is saying, "For I've delivered unto you that which I also received," right? I mean, it's in that kind of vein. It's as it says it right there. This is what we believe. That's all it is. And so he's just making this up out of his head. Just a story.
I agree. I think, but the story. And the stories after the stories in the Gospels of after Jesus rose made it very clear that this was meant to be a physical resurrection, right? He ate, Thomas wanted to feel the wounds in his hands and all that kind of stuff. Thomas was doubting whether or not he was actually risen and those kind of things. So
yeah. The other thing too, there was another point I wanted to make. Jonathan makes a big deal about the disciples not recognizing Jesus. Whoa, what is up with that? And I hear that a lot. Dale Allison will say this too. This is a meme that I hear quite a bit. It kind of disintegrates on further inspection though, because every one of the places, Mary Magdalene. Well, Mary Magdalene is in tears. She's tunnel vision focused on the tomb. We can't even tell if she's really paying attention or looking at Jesus when he speaks to her. That is a really natural explanation. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, and Douglas touches on that briefly there. We don't even know how close they were to Jesus or how intimately they would have known him. But also, too, there seems to be an indication that Jesus maybe didn't want to be recognized until he broke bread. So there could be that.
Right.
And then later, when they recognize him across the water, it's a little bit dark, and they're but after a little bit of peering, it quickly turns into, oh, hey, there's Jesus, and Peter jumps in and swims across to him. So there's really nothing to this, oh, wow, they didn't recognize him. And meanwhile, plenty of cases where they immediately recognize him, and Thomas touches him, and all those kinds of things. So that really doesn't hold water. But you hear that a lot. I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
I think...
You go ahead, Sam.
I think part of this, at least part of what's going on behind some of the things that Jonathan is saying, there's some debate or at least a tension or a polarization among some Christians where, people like David Bentley Hart, who I know that Pageau has kind of I think Pageau has mixed feelings on David Bentley Hart, right? But he's at least, David Bentley Hart's one of the other most famous Protestant to Orthodox converts that's with Pageau in that sort of, space. And David Bentley Hart will really emphasize sort of the weirdness and the spiritual nature of Jesus's resurrected body. And there are passages also in 1 Corinthians 15 that you can tug on for Jesus had like a different kind of body in some sense, right? It's not a flesh, it's like a pneumatico, but some sort of spiritual body. Which is, I'm not saying that, and some people kind of go what I would say is kind of in a Gnostic direction with that, right? Of Jesus turns into an ethereal spirit, right?
Yeah, kind of.
As opposed to being a physical person, right?
Which would be weird for, it would be weird for in a Gnostic sense for an ethereal spirit to eat fish. I'm just going to say that.
Right. And then there are some people who are like, well, there's two different kinds of stories about the resurrection. There are the people who are the very physical people like John, and then there are the people who are the more pneumatic spiritual kind of thing like Paul, because Paul does list himself as a person to whom the resurrected Jesus has appeared.
Well, okay, now there I agree. Okay, so there I am going to agree that we do have a difference in kind between how Paul saw Jesus, how Jesus appeared to him. It was veridical. Like the road to Damascus, we have something other people can sense, but it is not the same as the resurrection appearances to the apostles. So this is why, in my folks' whole kind of internecine apologetics struggle, why they're trying to put minimalism to bed, because minimalism tries to do everything through Paul, or as much as possible through Paul. And, the argument my folks will make is, you can't really do that indefinitely. You do want to go back to what the first apostles saw, what happened to those initial resurrection appearances, because it was, I think, pretty clearly intended to convey more than just a veridical vision. It was intended to convey a polymodal experience of touching, embracing, eating with, conversations with, that kind of thing. So I do agree there.
So I think some of that tension between sort of Jesus is a resurrected corpse versus Jesus is some sort of magnificent rainbow-bodied spiritual thingy.
Body.
Right. Well, I'm using your mom. Your mom brings that up in some of her videos. Yep. That's where I'm pulling that from.
Thank you.
But this, and I think that really the Gospels and the New Testament are saying a both and. Like, yes, Jesus has an immortalized, eternal, glorified, new creation human body, but it could eat fish, and
he's able to walk through walls. I mean, he can. Right. He can do
and he
stuff.
Can disappear on the road to Emmaus, right? He just, suddenly disappears. So there is some weirdness there. It's not just like a dead person became alive again and was otherwise undifferentiated from what he was before he died. Right.
But then you also get, Dale Allison in one interview is like sneering at the city of did Jesus have kidneys? Did he, which it also makes you think of like Brie and the horse and his boy. Like, imagine he would have to have a tail and whiskers, and and then Aslan sneaks up on him. Right. I think he should do that with Dale Allison. That would be fun. Anyway, and so I'm sorry to say it because I really do like Jonathan, but he sounds kind of Allison-ish in some of these bits.
I don't know. I actually think that Jonathan actually does think that Jesus had a real body.
I do think he does. It's just the way he comes off. Yeah.
Well, but that's the thing, right? And so this is part of Douglas's, even in this talk, his complaint is that it seems like they're bashful about actually affirming these claims, right? Embrace the weirdness, Douglas he says later. Don't back off these. Did it happen or did it not? And this goes back to what we were talking about with the exhausted versus inexhausted. The only way that Christianity is going to be an inexhausted force is if Jesus actually did walk out of that grave, in Douglas's mind.
So sorry, I was just going to say, connecting this back to the tragedy of the clergy point that he makes. So, getting back to Richard Holloway. So, after Douglas deconverted, Holloway was this kind of, he was sort of a guiding figure who helped to make deconversion make sense for him, and Holloway would ultimately be defrocked because he kind of went too far even for the Church of England with his heretical stuff. But there's this very poignant interview that Douglas had with him when Douglas was maybe my age, a little older, where they're talking and Holloway is doing it's the greatest story ever told. It's the da 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 da. And Douglas goes, but is it true? Much like in this conversation, but is it true? And there's this long, pregnant pause, and then finally Holloway goes, well, it's true in the sense that myth is true, but I don't think he got out of the grave. And that's his phrase. I don't think he got out of the grave. And it just sort of ends on this sad note. And that's all these years later, that's the question that Douglas is still asking, but did he get out of the grave? And
Right.
I think that missed opportunity there.
Yep. And I think, Jordan's not willing to say affirmatively yes. Jonathan,
No, he's not
in
there.
the conversation, does say, like, yeah, we do believe these things. So I was happy that he actually did. It's his reluctance to say,
And it was
that
a yeah,
upfront?
but it was like, why
Yeah.
are we yeah butting it? Why not just
right, exactly,
happened.
just say yes.
Yay! Hooray!
Yeah, just say yes. Like, I mean, I don't like the
He is risen indeed,
don't-
hallelujah. The Anglican thing.
I understand, like, I think that, like, his method of describing the Christian story and those kind of things can be useful for a certain person in a certain stage of their journey, but not for Douglas. Not for a guy like Douglas. Like, he wants to know, like, did he get out of the grave? Like,
Because Jordan and Jonathan, Jordan does as good a job, if not a better job than anyone else, of talking about sort of the mythical and psychological importance of the idea of the crucifixion and resurrection. And then Jordan's point is like, okay, well, if I can do that good of a job explaining how important this is from that lens, maybe that's just what I mean by it really happened,
Right.
and sort of
That's
trying
where he
to
kind of taps out,
Yeah, right. And he doesn't want to go any further, I think partly to kind of keep his scientific materialist credibility card with that portion of
for
his
sure.
audience. But it's also probably, I think, reflective of where he's at epistemologically himself too. I don't think it's inauthentic, but it's kind of both of those things.
Totally agree. Yeah.
yeah. So can on that note, can we go into the Platonic pragmatism hypothesis that I have right now? I think that's a good segue into it.
This was a little brainwave that Tripp had the other day. He's like, I've had an epiphany.
Yeah,
He's not
like I just
actually a
and maybe
pragmatist.
I'm sure someone else has had this before, but I haven't heard anyone else say it this way. And
Well,
so
I've said he's a Plato guy for a while,
Yeah.
but the way you put it together is really nice. So we'll get into that.
All right, and that's from this William Lane Craig debate clip.
Yeah, we'll start there, and then I think there's areas of this conversation that I think leads into that also are relevant. But yeah, let's start there.
All right.
I could say that whatever leads us as far away as we can possibly get from Auschwitz, that's good. Well,
No, I think we need to back it up a little bit.
All right.
Back it up to when he starts talking. Maybe I gave you this wrong link. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Just maybe the wrong timestamp. All right. So, okay, here he is, just getting up.
So let's pause it for a second. This is a debate with him, Steven Pinker's wife. I can't remember, Rebecca Goldstein.
That's Steven Pinker's wife?
You didn't know that? Yes,
I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
it is. It is Steven Pinker's wife. Yeah,
It's
Rebecca
just about as
Goldstein.
helpful as you would expect Steven Pinker's wife to be in this conversation.
and William Lane Craig. And so the debate is there meaning to life? And they're all trying to answer that question.
Terrible.
Yeah,
conversation.
it's not
the funny
a great.
thing is, though, okay, but fun fact, I think this may have been the very first clip of Peterson that I ever saw. In fact, I think this is how I first heard of Peterson back in the day, that somebody was talking about, because I knew William Lane Craig, of course.
Oh, interesting. Toronto,
then-
2018.
Yeah, and then my dad was like, oh, yeah, well, he's talking with this guy, Jordan Peterson. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, oh, this guy is kind of weird and interesting. And then I think maybe it was from there that I saw the Kathy Newman clip it was right around that same time. So this was my first exposure, really.
Gotcha.
This is coming full circle.
So I had found out about Peterson because of like the Bill C-16 thing, which was, you know, a couple years
earlier.
before that.
Yeah, so I came a
and
bit
so
later.
like I had found out, and I was like, oh, I kind of like this guy. He's like, don't tell me what to say. I like that. And then he did his Bible lectures, and then, you know,
it's like, there's way more here. Yeah.
I was like, oh, interesting. And then this happened, and so like anyway, so this is I would say it's a debate or whatever, but it's three different people giving very, very different answers to the question of it's not really a debate. Of
it's like a three views presentation,
right? And so William Lane Craig gives his very like William Lane Craig's treating it like a debate, but it's not really a debate.
He doesn't know how this new. It's the age of the conversation, Bill. Get with the program.
No. So like William Lane Craig is trying to like rebut and do all this kind of stuff, and like, I mean, Peterson actually, like, his intro is like a masterclass in presentation and rhetoric. Actually, he's really, really good at this kind of thing because he comes off like it's like a conversation, right? Yeah. Like I'm musing about this with my audience, and they laugh and all that kind of stuff. It's really well done rhetorically, but I think it is illustrative of Jordan Peterson's deeper philosophical beliefs, and so that's why I wanted to play this. So yeah, you can go ahead and play it.
I'm going to say one last thing. I think I just realized part of the reason why Jordan Peterson's sort of like preachy clips that he's been doing recently, or issues, or pundit style clips aren't as engaging, is because he has a unique ability to have a conversation even by himself, right? Whether it's with his classroom in his University of Toronto college lectures, or his biblical series, right? He can feel like you're there and that he's interacting with you, but his pundit clips don't have that feel to them, you know?
Right, because he's sitting down and he's just like staring at the camera.
Right.
Yeah,
it feels
like
sterile.
whenever he's up, like walking around and kind of like looking down and that kind of stuff, it has like a very different feel. Yeah.
And I'll also say that on the list of people who have better hair but are shorter than you think they are in person, Steven Pinker is also on that list.
I thought you were going to talk about me.
I kind of expected you to be short, so
Hey!
I'll put you on. I'll put you on that list too, Bethel.
You are treading on thin ice, my friend.
You, Steven Pinker, and Jonathan Pageau all have better hair, but are shorter than you think.
One of the things that's really struck me about intellectual life is how often we get the questions wrong. And we often get them backwards, not just wrong.
I just also have to say it's kind of weird seeing the RZIM logo on the back, and that's also a dating thing. And also, look at William Lane Craig's face right now. He's like, I don't know how to argue against this. This isn't
Who is this guy? Nothing prepared me for this. Also, Jordan looks so much younger. Wow, like it's only been 4 years. It's
4 years.
Kind of sad to think.
Yeah. All right. Sorry about that.
Wrong, but actually backwards. So, as a clinical psychologist, I've often treated people with anxiety, and people wonder, practically, individually, clinically, why are people anxious? And I think that's a completely ridiculous question. The reasons for anxiety are starkly self-evident. What I wonder is, why aren't people terrified out of their skulls so badly every second of their life that they can't even move? Yeah, and you all laugh because you understand that. It's like anxiety, that's no mystery. It's like brief spells of calm. That's a mystery. Okay, and a client will come to me and say, well, I'm procrastinating. Why do I procrastinate? It's like, no, that's a stupid question. It's easy just to sit there and do nothing. What's the mystery is why you ever get up and do anything difficult at all. Procrastination is the default. And psychologists ask, doctors ask, well, why do people take cocaine? It's like, no, it's It's the wrong question.
It's like stand-up.
The right question is, why not, like an addicted rat, don't you just take cocaine all the time until you die? That's the question. And this question about meaning is like that too. Is there meaning in life? That's a stupid question. And I'm serious about that. That's not a question you ever ask yourself if you're in pain, right? Because when you're in pain, you know that life has a meaning. It's the pain. And you can't argue yourself out of that meaning. And so when we're asking whether or not life has meaning, that isn't what we mean. What we mean is, in the face of life's pain and suffering, does life have any positive meaning? And that is not the same question.
Okay, you can pause it there.
Now, I'm going to leave that aside for a minute, and I'm going to...
So the reason that I wanted to bring this up, because in this talk with Douglas Murray, he makes very similar points. Like he constantly talks about suffering. He talks about the need for suffering to like kind of stare through the abyss, right? And we can play that clip if we have it. We can play that clip if we have it queued up. But you can see what he's doing there is that he's, so take a step back. Is Jordan Peterson often like describes himself as a pragmatist, and he doesn't mean that in like a everyday I just how he lives
like
his life
the way
kind
a
of
politician would say it.
right? Not that.
Yeah, people
kind
don't
of way.
understand the philosophical connotations.
So like
of it.
he means a pragmatist from a philosophical perspective. And so like going back to like James and the American pragmatist philosophy is that what is like they reject the correspondence theory of truth, right? What is true according to the way that reality is. Like they reject that. They're like, no, truth is what works. And so like Jordan Peterson describes himself as a pragmatist in that sense. So like truth is really what works according to a pragmatist. Now there's lots of things to say about pragmatism, but I think that what we're seeing here is that Jordan Peterson's not a pragmatist. Because what he's doing there is he's elevating the mental state of the person to the highest realm of truth, right?
Although he might say that he's a phenomenological pragmatist.
I mean, you can say that, but at some point, but a phenomenological pragmatist is still like what works, like what is the most real thing, right? Mm-hmm. Is it what works? Well, or is it like the mental state? So what he did right there was say that like my pain, my suffering, that is the most real thing. That's the thing I cannot deny. You can't argue me out of. Like what works is outside of the realm of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that is what's real.
Well, and really, I mean, isn't what you're noting here really just the inevitable collapse of pragmatism because it's like fundamentally epistemologically bankrupt? And so,
right.
You can't sustain a pragmatist theory of truth. It's always going to collapse to some sort of correspondence theory, even when we're talking about what works or, well, the truth is what gets us there, or the roadmap to where? To there. Well, where's there? Oh, you mean to like a place that corresponds to a real place that we want to be, Okay, well, there we are. Congrats,
and so that's where,
really pragmatist.
Yeah. And so this is my hypothesis, and I don't know that I've heard anyone say this like in quite the way I'm going to say it. So Sam, I sent it to Bethel before. I sent it to Bethel before, but I'd like to get your feedback on it. But basically, my hypothesis is that Jordan Peterson is a Platonist. But the forms that he's talking about, the real things, are mental states. It's suffering, it's happiness, it's pain, it's joy, it's those things. So he's a Platonist. Now, but even in the Platonic realm, you have hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Plato,
Peterson loves hierarchies. Peterson has no problem with hierarchies. Lobster hierarchies, all
and this
sorts
fits
of hierarchies.
this fits very, very well in with Plato, right? Because say let's take the allegory of the cave. So at the start, you're kind of tied and you're watching shadows on a wall. So you're seeing light, like the light is representing the highest good in the Platonic hierarchy. And so you're seeing it reflected back to you, but because it's a reflection, it's not as real. So then you loosen yourself, and you get out of your bindings, and you turn around and you see kind of like these flames. Well, that's more real than the reflection on the wall. But then you see up the cave a brighter light coming out of the entrance to the cave. And so you make your way up there until you get outside, and then you see the sun, which is the highest good, right? And so even in the Platonic realm, or the realm of the forms, you have this idea of these hierarchies of these forms. So fits very well in with Jordan Peterson's entire entire thing. So really, what Jordan Peterson is my hypothesis, is he's a Platonist. The forms are your mental states, and pragmatism, a pragmatic epistemology, is how you figure out which of these mental states are the ones that you should pursue, because it's what works, right? So you can say, well, pursuing your happiness isn't necessarily what you should always pursue. Sometimes you actually have to go through the suffering in order, and he says it in here, you peer through the abyss to see the love and the gratitude and to appreciate it and those kind of things. So it's whatever works. What you should do is whatever works, but it's in order to pursue these higher level mental states that you want to achieve, and these forms that you want to attain.
I think that the bridge for Peterson between his pragmatism and his Platonism, and I think his Platonism comes from his Jungian stuff, right? Jung was knew how Platonic Jung was, right? Archetypes are very similar to, a theory of forms, right? And so, and Jung knew that perfectly well. And I think that Peterson has read enough of Jung, and that's so important to the way he thinks that's
trickle down
in
Plato.
there from that. Trickle down Plato through Jung. And Pageau also is a self-avowed Platonist, because he loves Max the Confessor and those sort of late classical church father, Eastern Orthodox Neoplatonists, basically. And I think for Peterson, the connection between pragmatism and sort of the ideal is that through basically the Darwinian process, truth becomes more and more revealed, right? As if and I talked a little bit about this with Vervaeke, sort of the form of the perfect animal in the sky being the thing that selects upon the animals here, and that the Darwinian process, I know, Bethel, this isn't your favorite thing, but I'm just connecting some dots.
Oh, it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
That the Darwinian process is sort of grappling its way up the hierarchy, making animals closer and closer to their Platonic form. And that is sort of true at kind of both a minute by minute level for us, because one of Peterson's definitions of God, right, when he's talking with Sam Harris, and Sam Harris is all right, well, tell me what you mean by God. And Peterson's let me get out my tablet. I have 14 bullet points that I have prepared for you of my definitions for God.
10 minutes later.
One of them is that which selects among great men. Basically, right?
Yep.
As if there is this great man archetype, right? And human beings can come closer or further away from embodying that in our own lives. And the men that embody that succeed both in sort of a pragmatic sense and the Darwinian sense together, right? And that the selection process moves men closer and closer to the archetype. And we've decided that Christ is that archetype. Right. And I think that is sort of the bridge for Peterson between this like Jungian archetype land, right, and pragmatism, is that it's like basically the Darwinian process that rewards success through selection that brings the archetypes down here in a very pragmatic, practical sense. And like when he, like, how does Jordan Peterson think that we have myths in our mind? Right? Like he very much thinks that we have myths in our mind, and that, like, you know, Beauty and the Beast is just like this story that has emerged from eons and eons of fairy tale telling. The collective subconscious. Yeah. So how do we have a collective subconscious that has a similar structure in our minds where we can say Beauty and the Beast is like the best version of the story that we already have in our minds somewhere? And I think he would say that it got programmed into us through the evolutionary process because it's useful, because it's actually a map of deeper reality, and that our brains are programmed to be in tune with that because that's pragmatically successful or something like that.
But the problem is you need a programmer. Okay, you need a storyteller.
You need the next step. You need the next step in the Platonic hierarchy. Okay, so where'd the forms come from?
For sure. I'm not claiming that this is like a self this is the
not at all. But it's a great way of laying out where he is so far.
I just think that like that's what he is like he's a Platonist because he has the archetypes, these mental states, he has all these kind of things, and like deciding which you should pursue is a pragmatic endeavor for him, and so that fits very well into like evolutionary psychology and everything else like that. So like it makes
so that's how he's trying his grand unifying theory.
He's not actually a pragmatist in that sense. Like he's actually a Platonist, and pragmatism is his epistemology. Yeah.
Well, and I would even maybe slightly quibble there because, I mean, I think I would say, like, in the end, like I was saying earlier, he's really collapsing to a correspondence epistemology because everyone has to collapse to a correspondence epistemology at the end. But it's a sort of a selective, pragmatic process. I would also say, I mean, coming out of all this, similar to all this, he's a moral realist. And I've known, like, I'm thinking of at least one Christian friend I know who will somehow try to claim that he can be a Christian and not be a moral realist at the same time. I don't know how he does this. I don't know how he thinks this is possible. But, like, I want to say, dude, you should go listen to more Jordan Peterson, okay? Because Peterson's a moral realist. He understands that. And, I mean, that's almost like a precondition for Christianity, I feel like. And so I don't know how you can try to make the lack of that work with Christianity.
Well, and you see, same thing with the meaning question. So, like, what I did like about Jordan's, like, intro, like, comments in the William Lane Craig debate is, like, he kind of, like, he's like, listen, we all know there's meaning. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not even going to debate this, right? I'm not, like, we know this is true. And so, one of the things that, but we can kind of intellectualize ourselves out of that position, right? Even though, like, we know that there's meaning, we can, like, intellectualize ourselves out of it. And so what's interesting in this conversation, and I don't know if we have that clip pulled up, but, like, Douglas Murray starts to, are we meaning-seeking creatures, or is there meaning?
Yeah.
Is this question.
I think that's where he quotes Rilke, right?
Yeah, and one of the things is that he starts it out saying, is there, are we just like kind of meaningful in some kind of like, trivial sense to our family, to our friends, and that kind of stuff. But then he adds in the comment at some point. Maybe we can pull it up.
I've got that ready. Yeah.
Where he's talking about like, and that's not nothing. Like that's the one that I want.
I hope so. I think so.
Okay, go ahead.
Pick up on this point again, because we might be returning to this what I describe as these two problems we've got to address. The first is whether it's possible to accept the idea of religion being true in some sense and essentially philosophy for the masses, which is how many 19th century thinkers were already thinking about it. That you can say it's true in some sense and It's the best way to allow the largest number of people to contend with the deepest set of ideas, because philosophy is only ever going to be an elite sport, and in no derogatory term of the meaning elite, but only a small number of people are going to engage in it. Most people are not going to engage in it. Therefore, religion is the best means to engage with meaning in the world. That's one way of seeing things to begin with. But the second, and that's something we could contend with. But the second thing I wanted to say is just to give Jonathan a breather, as it were, on some of my demands, which is what about the non-religious in this? And the non-religious problem in all of this, it comes back to what you described earlier, Jordan, as the patterns problem. The patterns we see in the universe, including patterns of truth. What does the non-believer do when they find, for instance, the beauty of a mathematical formula, which works and is there and is true? What does it mean? What does it mean when we find the extraordinary patterns in nature? What does it mean when we find patterns in our own lives? And what you describe as things like that thing that people can recognize, of needing to see through the void and see the glimpse of light. What do we do about the sense, for instance, that we know that we're contending with a very, very difficult problem in our lives, so many difficult problems in our lives, one of which, perhaps the deepest of which is, does this matter? Does this matter beyond itself? Or one of my favorite quotes from Rilke. Rilke says in one of the Duino elegies, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Now, our senses, probably one of our deepest hopes is that the answer is yes. Yes. That what we do in our lives does not just matter to us, or just to the people around us, although that's not nothing, but matters in some far higher sense. And then we get to that question underneath that, which is, are we simply meaning-seeking beings, or is there meaning? And the problem with this question is it leans us towards the second one. Our deepest hope is that the second one is true.
So that was my, so.
Well, the patterns, that's a lovely connection too, because he's pointing out, okay, what do you do? This is my challenge, right? So he's like,
maybe
here's the challenge
Platonism?
for
Yeah.
Platonism? I know, right. Well, it's his own way of pointing that out, and where it's like, okay, things seem to be programmed. Where's the programmer? There seem to be patterns. Where's the artist? Where's the, this is what this is all tending to. But go ahead, what you were going to say.
Well, no, I was going to say the other thing is that, and why, I think that Jordan Peterson's intro to that debate was so good was because he just rejected the question outright, even though that's not the rules of the debate, because what Douglas just did was admit from the very outset, because he said, and that's not nothing. Notice whenever he said, does this just matter to me and the people around me? Though that's not nothing. You're like, well, Douglas, why? Why is that not nothing? Are you sure? Are you sure it's not actually nothing?
Right.
Because, it seems like it could be. Why is that not an answer? But he can't even, he just rejects that outright as self-evidently false. And I think he's right to do so. But then the question becomes, why? Why is it not nothing? And
well, this came out really... I was just going to say this came out really beautifully in the conversation that he and I had, because we got into a discussion of suicide, actually. And assisted dying and euthanasia and stuff, which he's actually written pretty well about in a pretty pro-life way. And he was talking about how he would try to encourage friends of his when they were depressed or maybe even possibly suicidal. And he would refer to this passage in King Lear where a character thinks that he's committed suicide, but he hasn't actually, because his son is there with him and is going to make sure his father doesn't commit suicide. And then is encouraging him that life in itself is worth living. That there's a good to existence. There's a good to life. And then Douglas articulated that in his own way, and I don't remember how he put it, but it was very eloquent. I urge people to go look that up. And so then we had a break just then, and when I came back, I was trying to go yes, I agree. Now, play the tape out. And I have this quote from Balfour, which maybe I'll read out at some point, but I don't want to interrupt. What were you going to go on to say there?
Well, I think that you're right, and that Jordan is at least hinting in that direction, right? And it's sort of like an inductive proof, right? Like, we got meaning at one level, we can go up one level with that meaning too, right? You've got meaning inside yourself. You matter to your family members. That's like an expanded circle, right? And in math, all you need, if true at n and true at n plus 1 because of n, then on to infinity, right?
That warms the cockles of my heart. Thank you. Yeah, nice analogy
for you guys. Yeah, I hope the audience loved that as much as us math nerds do. You being the chief math nerd among us, Bethel. But I think that I had this thought as Douglas was talking there about sort of the Platonism thing. I think that what Jordan is kind of grappling for a way to say that is really fully convincing to someone like Douglas is that, look, if Christianity is symbolically true, mythologically true, archetypally true, or whatever that register of Peterson talking means, that means that it has gotten into us, right, basically from this evolutionary process, and it got into us because it exists at this higher level, right? Mm-hmm. And if it's gotten into us, then it exists at the higher level, and therefore it must also be true in the level that you want it to be true, that you're having trouble believing is true.
Well, okay,
right? If it works, it's beautiful, and that must mean it's part of the universe, and therefore it's true in the very materialistic sense also that you're struggling to get your heart around accepting.
Right. No,
right.
I think
so it's like the arrow must go from that direction, right? So like we know we can get up higher, and then it's going to come back and pick up what you're right. Okay, yeah, but so I it's clever, but I mean I think you have to do this the inference to the best explanation way, which he's also kind of doing, So that's the way to pull this all together in a really, a thorough, rigorous way. I think just need a good epistemologist in there to kind of pull this all together.
Well, so what do you think Douglas's reaction would be to a very well epistemologically argued argument for the resurrection? What do you think? Like, if you let your mom and your dad loose on him for half an hour, an hour.
Something tells me Bethel's already made that pitch to Douglas.
I mean, he's been reading my Substack for like a year now. Although, granted, I keep my Substack pretty light on, pure apologetic stuff. But, I mean, I think he actually kind of already answered that question in our convo, because I think he more or less signaled to me and to Justin that it's really not an intellectual issue for him. That he said, I think the way he put it was, it's not like an intellectual honesty thing. He said some people are there where they feel like it would be intellectually dishonest of them to embark on that, but that's not me. That's not where I'm at. And he said, I think I would need to hear a voice from heaven. And if I'd been more on the ball, I would have asked what he wants the voice to say. But I wasn't quite that on the ball. So instead, I just kind of said, I think we have.
You woke up a week later.
Why did I not say that? Okay, but the answer I gave was fine, which is that I think we have enough light to believe even without a voice. And then he clarified, well, I'm just saying that I'm not saying that it has to be that high. Just for me, that's kind of where the bar is. And I mean, there are many reasons why a guy like Douglas might not want to commit to Christianity. Okay, let's just kind of put it that way. I suspect it's not that I think he's insincere when he talks about these other hesitations. I mean, I think he still has those. I think he hasn't ever come around and taken the time to really internalize this. And I think he could. I mean, as a journalist, there's so much cool stuff around the reliability of the Gospels and the reportage model that I could kind of unlock for him as a fellow writer, where I think he would have to admit it's pretty cool as a journalist. But like, I just don't know that he would want to take the additional step, because, there's a different clip here where he talks about how it's a commitment. It demands something of you if you're actually going to commit to this. And so that's why I also don't think it quite works when Pageau talks about how, well, you just need to join a church and do the practice, and then the other stuff will kind of figure itself out. And I'm thinking, you mean like taking communion? Like how much of the practice are you saying you should be doing? Because
Right.
I'm
Well,
going,
he was
no.
probably baptized as a kid, and all under Anglican rules, I think he would be allowed
Officially,
to.
Well,
I sure.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way: I sure hope he's not taking communion. I mean, that would be like, I'd be
And
like,
the-
no, don't.
In the
do
Church
that.
of England, they'll give.
Well, I
communion
know.
to pretty, like,
I know
stuff,
they will,
yeah.
but I think more stuff is going to have to happen for Douglas, besides the intellectual, in order for him to actually make the leap.
Tripp
Well,
and I talked about this a couple days ago, that the gay thing is
Yeah,
a
I mean,
thing.
you said it. I wasn't going to say it, but you said it.
Yes. I think Tripp and I talked about this, and Bethel, I think you and I had a similar
And Tripp and I
maybe
also. I mean, we've all
text
kind of.
message conversation or direct message conversation
Yep.
sometime in the past that was like, look, Douglas wants full-throated Christianity and all of its unashamed weirdness and historical vibrancy. And everyone knows that part of that package is Christianity's historical traditional sexual ethic and
Yep.
marriage teachings.
I know, and I made that point in the article that I wrote, because he's going, weird, be more weird, be counterculture. I'm like, how weird? Not quite that
part
weird.
of where that goes full well, Douglas.
Right? Well, and
Right.
his old hero, Richard Holloway, again, I mean, one of the ways in which Holloway was a heretic was that he would, quote unquote, marry gay couples who came to him. He wasn't like officially allowed to, but he would give them like these, secret commitment ceremonies, which, I mean, it'd be an interesting question. Like, does Douglas admire that? Does he think that was like an edgy, great thing for Holloway to do? Because it wasn't terribly weird of him to do that. It wasn't terribly countercultural. It was the exact opposite, in fact. So what does Douglas really want? That goes back to my wish I would have asked him, what did he want the voice to say,
But so, like, to bring this, back to the original, or the first point that we went over, like, that's the inexhaustive versus exhaustive force. And so, like, if, like, he wants Christianity to be an inexhaustive force, something that can affirm its own claims, and something that isn't just simply reactionary or resistive to the forces around it. And for Christianity, that means you have to affirm it all, right? You have to affirm that Jesus, like, sat up in the grave. You have to affirm that, like, homosexuality is wrong. You have to affirm all of those things and have the courage and the force to do that, and not just simply resist whenever the culture says something different. And so, like, no, I don't think that he would respect a Christianity that didn't say, actually, homosexuality is not okay. I don't think that he would respect a Christianity that said, actually, monogamy is not really, necessary.
He
I don't
would
think
see
he would
that as
respect
a sign of Christianity giving in, and that it
being
was
an exhausted force.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's how we would see that.
And so then the question is, okay, Douglas, so the Christianity you want is going to give a full-throated, unashamed answer that we see in Adam and Eve, the reflection of the coming together of male and female into one flesh, yada, yada, yada. I won't give the whole speech now, but we know what it would say. You're not doing that. And in fact, you're doing something very starkly offensive to that vision. And if you want to be a part of this community, you have to stop.
I think you would at least respect it. Even if you wouldn't convert, I think you would at least respect that. Because I think that what he... Yeah, go ahead.
And I find it so much easier to talk to a guy like Douglas and be friendly with a guy like Douglas than with somebody who does the things that Douglas does, or near enough as makes no difference, while still claiming to be a Christian. Like, I can't imagine having any kind of interaction at all with somebody like that, right? I mean, like, that type is on a different planet to me, as far as I'm concerned. But I can interact with Douglas because he's honest enough to make the clean break. To just say, well, I guess that makes me an atheist now. It's like, great, then now we can have a conversation, But we can't have a conversation as long as you're bullshitting, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's something that Douglas does not do, and he does a very good job of trying to articulate where he is coming from.
Yep.
Yeah. And so like, this conversation was focused a lot on, the intellectual, questions regarding like, say, the resurrection and that kind of stuff. But like, obviously there's a lot more going on there, right? Like, with Douglas. And so, I don't want to be too hard on Jonathan and Peterson because like there's obviously a lot going on there. I just don't think that like what Douglas is looking for is what they were trying to give him, right? He was looking for a very different answer than the one they were trying to give. They were giving an exhausted force Christianity, and he was looking for an inexhausted force Christianity.
Yeah, what we really need to do is like,
and
Justin
he still
just
might
needs to
reject.
yeah, he might still, but
He might
like,
still reject the inexhausted force, but that's what he was looking for, and that's not what he was getting from Jonathan and Peterson. I mean, Jonathan eventually kind of like said, what it was but he wasn't like making the case for it. And
right. So Justin
that.
needs to get me and Douglas together again for like 2 hours, and then at the end of that, he won't have any excuses left. No, that's not going to happen. But that would be fun.
But one thing. So another thing is beyond like the political, because I think that one of the, obviously like Douglas is kind of like a conservative commentator and that kind of stuff and those kind of things. One of the things though that you get to at the last part of the talk is they start talking a lot about like aesthetics.
That was actually a really
beauty.
fun part, and we're probably not going to get to play any of it, but it was so cool, and I loved it.
Yeah, and so I loved it too, and so like this is one of the things that I think that Christians need to think more about. For like the medievals, like there were the three transcendentals. There's truth, goodness, and beauty. Beauty is the one that draws you in. Beauty is the one that's attractive to everyone. So even someone like Douglas, who's resisting the truth of Christianity, who's resisting even the ethic to some extent of Christianity, he goes to a evensong.
Of course he does.
Right.
Well, and I mean, of course, that's also all bound up with being an Anglican aesthete, being a gay aesthete. I'm sorry, but there is that type, that who art, darling. Just
right.
Like,
well, no, but like there's the beauty of Jordan Peterson goes on about the beauty of the cathedrals, and they talk about the evensong and everything. So they start talking about that. That's the one that brings it in. I actually think that that's an underrated aspect of Christian apologetics and evangelism is the beauty.
Yeah.
Of our cathedrals, the beauty of our history, of our music, of our worship, of all these things, of our art. This is something that draws you in. The truth and the goodness can be repellent to a lot of people, but the beauty draws you in. It's the one transcendental that like is irresistible to people like Douglas.
Well, that's part of
so I think. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's part of the tragedy that he's articulating, where, almost sort of concurrent with the tragedy of the clergy, you have the tragedy of like the church trying to shed itself of its most beautiful traditions, the bastardization of the liturgy, like the watering down of all of these things, or like his old church closed that he wrote about once. And so I'm thinking, like, you're driving away. It's like the last thread in some sense that keeps sort of drawing Douglas back, insert Brideshead Revisited reference here.
And this is something that like Sam and I talked about in our talk before was this, it wasn't 67, it was 63, Sam, Scientific American article. I got the year wrong. But it was by, so Bethel, it's by Paul Dirac. Right,
Rep. It's a math guy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, like, he's the Nobel Prize winning physicist, but he was talking about Schrodinger's one of his equations. And so the idea was Schrodinger was gonna, he had this equation for describing, some of the behaviors of, subatomic particles and those kind of things. And so he wanted to publish it, but they went to like test out his equation in the laboratory, and it didn't conform to experiment. Like his equation didn't work, but it was just so beautiful of an equation, so elegant, that even though he didn't publish it, he came back to it over and over again. And he eventually decided to kind of approximate his equation and publish it anyway, because he just thought it was so beautiful of an equation.
But did it end up doing anything? Or
it did.
Okay.
So basically, yes. So basically, eventually, the equation, the reason it didn't conform to experiment was because they didn't know that electrons had a spin. And so once you incorporate the spin of the electron, the equation was correct. And it did conform to experiment. And so Dirac at the end of this article says, well, what are we to say? Except that sometimes beauty is more important than conforming to experiment.
Wow.
In one's equations.
That's amazing.
And so this is where like you can tie these transcendentals together, that like, okay, beauty draws you in. Truth might be repellent, but actually beauty is an indicator of truth. And so like we should like embrace this. And I think that you're seeing it with Peterson and you're seeing it with Murray. And obviously Pageau is an artist, so he sees
Peterson,
this too.
For Peterson, this works in his Darwinian pragmatic Platonism of natural selection for beautiful creatures. Yep. Right? Yep. Like, why in the world do birds spend all this time looking beautiful and female birds finding other beautiful male birds attractive, right? Like, what in the world's going on with that? You know, and Peterson brings up natural selection based off of beauty quite often, right? That's one of his sort of stock and trade points. And like he brings it up when he's talking to Richard Dawkins and other people like that. And I think for him, that's sort of one of the ways that he's firing on that transcendental cylinder, is that, hey, you know, if beauty helps birds, you know, pick mates, there must be something really profound going on with beauty.
No, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, Sam. That is a really good point, and I think that we downplay beauty as an apologetic and an evangelistic tool in terms of like engaging people like Douglas, because like
I don't know. Have you been to Hillsong with the smoke and the skinny jeans and the 4-chord songs with?
Dude, I went to Mars Hill for a long time. I went to Mars Hill for a long time.
Do they put the pretty people or the ugly people up on stage playing guitar and piano and singing?
Oh.
So what are they doing? They're doing something. They know, they get it. and beauty is also in some sense, you know, culturally specific and contextually specific. I'm not saying in the ultimate sense, but you know, you got to reach people in the ways that they find attractive.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things where you go. Yeah.
But I did love. Yeah. I did love to to get back to the bit about Evensong. He says the reason he picks Evensong is because it's the best way to engage without engaging. Is his phrase. So he knows exactly how far he's willing to go, but no farther. Right. You know.
Well, and Evensong is the perfect way to experience the beauty.
Yeah.
Without being
okay, for a
non-Anglican
nerd, what's this Evensong business? Is it some nightly or nightcap liturgy service?
Kinda, yeah, it's sort of. It's,
I mean, essentially, it's in the evening, and so there's liturgy and there's choir and singing. There's no sermon. And so
no communion, right?
No Eucharist.
So see, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, it's a place to go and experience the beauty of the church, the beauty of the liturgy, the beauty of the music, without actually participating
in the practice.
And the practice, and then also without
like
receiving, and also without receiving instruction. So that's the difference with an Evensong versus a normal service. So you're gonna it's
It's
like
an
going to
experience.
Going
see
to
Handel.
listen to Handel in Christmas time. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that it's like going to see Handel's Messiah. I went to see Handel's Messiah in the cathedral. I didn't go to mass. Right? It's a different thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that's what's drawing him in, and like that's what he goes to, and that's they spent it was so fascinating to me that Douglas he kept going back to poetry, right?
Yeah.
Like
I know, I loved
express-
it. He's like, I'm sorry to keep referring to poets, but maybe it's a good thing to keep referring to him. Like, yes, more
Yes.
poetry. More
Right.
poetry, Douglas. And I have my own poetry that I could throw in on the pile here too, actually here, since we're doing this, let me look at one of my favorite poems here, which funny enough, I keep like dunking on Richard Holloway through this, but it was Holloway who introduced me to this poem, so I gotta give him that much. It's this poem called Missing God by Dennis O'Driscoll. So I won't like read the whole thing, but it's it sort of sets up the whole subtraction story that like we don't say grace anymore, fish multiply without his intercession, and then there's this stanza, yet though we rebelled against him like adolescents, uplifted to see an oppressive father banished, a bearded hermit to the desert, we confess to missing him at times. And then it's this like, miss him when this, miss him when that. And that's how all the stanzas go. And I'll skip down to this one. Miss him when the radio catches a snatch of plain chant from some echoey priory, when the gospel choir raises its collective voice to ask, shall we gather at the river? Or the forces of the oratorio converge on I know that my Redeemer liveth, and our contracted hearts lose a beat. And I was thinking about this when I watched Queen Elizabeth's funeral. So I wrote something around that. And there was this amazing moment at the beginning where the pallbearers carried the coffin to the doorway and the choir burst into I am the resurrection and the life. It was like, whoa, beauty, like all the thing, it's just the pomp and ceremony of the scriptures, and just it was so beautiful, and all this stuff that the queen had handpicked herself, that like she wanted this to lay out the whole pageantry of it, the whole glory of the Christian story. But it felt like Paul Kingsnorth wrote this great article that felt like a last post for the West. It's like the last call of the trumpet, and then it's going to fade away. And it's dying with her, but there it was. It was all there for us to see.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, and obviously like that echoes like a lot of Douglas's books, that like his great consternation is that the West is fading, right? It's dying. It's a spent, it's a spent force. It's an exhausted force, and Christianity, I think, is one of the reasons that he suspects that that's the case, that it's an exhausted force, and so like that's what I think he wants from the church.
But he doesn't just want a non-exhausted force, because Islam doesn't seem exhausted to him, nor
Right.
does wokeism, critical race, social
Correct.
justiceism, right, which seems to have an energy and enthusiasm and a self-confidence in a weird kind of bizarre
He's
way.
talked about that actually. Like I've seen, he's actually mentioned the irony. There's a really dark interview that he did in more ways than one. It was like horribly shot, but with this Swedish or Danish lady, where he talks about how it's ironic that Islam doesn't seem to have any trouble attracting converts, because it knows what it is and what it's offering. So
Right.
it's doing what in some sense Christianity isn't, at least in certain contexts. But right, of course the question is, okay, well then why isn't he attracted to that? Well, it's a dark energy. So we need this to be united with a sense of the good,
Right.
And so he's still rooting for
Deleuze, like,
Christian.
yeah. to go back to Deleuze's description of the Hegelian, like it has the strength to affirm its difference. Like it's not just reactionary. Like it knows what it is, both like kind of woke progressivism and Islam. Like they're not hiding the ball. Like they're not like just reacting and resisting. They're actively trying to push forward. And that's what Douglas does want, that, but not just that, because there's an ugliness and like a lack of goodness to both of those things for him. And so he's not going to go along with them. So it's not just, he doesn't, to Sam's point, he doesn't just want an inexhausted force. He wants an inexhausted, true, good, beautiful force.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, so I mean, we don't have to get political, but I think this is an interesting kind of related political point, because I've seen conservatives make a similar lament that conservatism can tend to be defined by just reacting to liberalism, whereas liberals seem to have a very clear agenda, sense of identity, like, okay, we're going to take over the universities and the entertainment industry and the this and the that, and they've done all those things.
And here's what we're going to do once we do it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so conservatives are out there going, where is the positive vision of conservatism? And we're starting to see that more, I think, with like NatCon, or, you know, this viral clip that's been going around of what's her face, who became prime minister in Italy. Everyone's excited about her. So, I mean, that's going to be an interesting thing to watch in the future for conservatives like me, is can conservatives sort of get some spunk, you know, get some a fire lit under them to where they're actually pushing forward a positive vision.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the you know, I mean, there's always like the Burkean kind of like, you know, conservative that I think that, you know, we kind of lost, and, you know, we kind of like in a certain way, like conservatives won some battles and then got very complacent. And I think then just became like a resistive force in at least American culture. And so I think that like, but you know, it's I mean, at this point, I'm gonna side with Peterson and just be a pragmatist and be like, listen, like, if conservatives are right, then their opposition will fail. And you know, they'll like, there will be a reaction to the failures of the opposition. And you know, they'll get better. And at some point we have to be pragmatists about this and be like, well, if we're right, like, this is going to get obvious.
What kind of pragmatist? The political kind or the philosophical kind?
The political kind. But it does lead back to like, well, what works is, I'm a firm believer, and this is like one of my critiques of like Sam Harris's arguments against like, Sam Harris likes to talk about free will.
Metaphorical. Sorry.
Yeah, or I was thinking about free will. And so he talks about like, well, no, free will obviously doesn't exist. Like that's what of course not. Of course
he said freely.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but then he was like, well, but what do you tell your kid whenever you want him to do something different? And he's like, well, of course I have to talk to him as if free will exists.
Peter's like, well, okay. See, you know, like.
And I was like, listen, I'm not a philosophical pragmatist.
I'm
not a philosophical pragmatist. At the same time, if your explanation for the world cannot actually be acted out, if it cannot be acted out in the world in any kind of real way without it failing, then whatever explanation you're giving me is bullshit.
Yeah.
And that's, I'm sorry, like it also has to work. Mm-hmm. There might be a lot of things that work that aren't true, but the things that are true need to work. And so that's. But
this is where we get
in the long run, right? part of what the definition of evil might be is things that work well in the short run but are self-extinguishing and have a habit of extinguishing the things that they touch.
Well, that goes back to Jordan Peterson's like Platonic pragmatism, right? Because it needs to work for me. It needs to work for me right now. It needs to work for me throughout my life. It needs to work for me and my family, me and my community, me and my society, and then work over time. That is the highest good that we should aim for. And so that's where he's using pragmatism as like a sorting mechanism for these Platonic like forms. He's not using it as truth. He's using it as a way of determining how we should sort things. And that's a very different thing. So he calls himself a pragmatist, but he's not.
Right. There is a limitation though, because we were just talking about Islam, right? And we were talking about success, like which religions have been successful. And Islam is clearly very successful and has been for however many hundreds of years now at this point. And this has been more successful than many far more benign religious movements, right? And so, I don't know that you can indefinitely lean on evil. Evil is self-extinguishing. In the very, very long run, of course, I do believe that.
Well, that's the thing. But, I think it's a matter of just time scale, right?
Yeah,
it might
and it's hard to know in the present, right?
Exactly.
That's the one tricky problem for this sort of Darwinian pragmatic Platonism is like, well, so how much time do you really need to know the truth, and do you ever get to have that amount of time? And what's that mean going forward, right?
Right.
Okay, so, Christianity has 2 billion people, Islam has 1.5 billion people. Christianity's been around for 2,000 years, Islam 1,400 years. So,
exactly.
If we look at their growth rates over the millennia, and is that really how you're going to, decide whether to go to mosque or to church?
I know. So it doesn't really.
Oh, I don't think it's a good epistemology. I just think that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
Well, right, and I actually kind of agree with it, but it does have this weird, we see through a glass darkly now in time, with only so much history in hindsight problem.
Yeah,
right?
and
so
I was going to say World War II makes a nice, well, look how the Nazis imploded and how they lost and Hitler ended up committing suicide. It's like, okay, so that is a really nice short illustration, but what if the Nazis had won? Would that mean they weren't evil anymore? I had a long kind of fruitless conversation with Adam Friended where I was trying to...
that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, you remember
Adam Friended is this too. Adam Friended is a Platonic Darwinian pragmatist.
Yeah, I know, and I was trying to help him, and Glen Schrivener had a convo too where he tried to help him see this, and it's like, it wasn't working, but this is what we were trying to get him to. What if the Nazis won? Well, they didn't win. Well, but what if they had won?
Well, maybe they couldn't have, right? Or maybe they would have had to change so much to win that they wouldn't have been Nazis anymore.
Well, I don't know.
right?
Do you call this winning for Islam over the 1400 years? This is where we get back to
Islam also has plenty of its own problems too. But and Islam, it's like one of those things where, on the grand scheme of things of world religions, Islam and Christianity are pretty darn close.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And they, in some sense, they reinforce each other's pragmatic, value a little bit because of their similarity.
Now, Judaism,
how many empires? I was going to say, how many empires though were absolutely brutal and horrible compared to even their neighbors, right? So so let's go back to the ancient Israelites. They had two neighbors that were particularly worrisome for them in Babylon and Assyria, but even they were both bad. But even the Babylonians were afraid of the Assyrians. The Assyrians were brutal. Absolutely brutal. This is why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh and preach to these people. They would flay and their enemies. They were absolutely brutal and ended up sacking even Babylon. Okay, are we to say well, something was working there? Right,
but they weren't very good at winning over their neighbors voluntarily, and Babylon was slightly better at that, and then Persia was slightly better,
but they both
was
collapsed.
Slightly better, and then Rome was slightly better, right?
But they
to get bigger and bigger and bigger, you had to be nicer.
building the statue in Daniel's dream, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but okay. Well, so give me like a Palantir to zoom out like
Thank you,
10,000
yeah.
years, and then I'll like then we can use that as a method for determining truth and goodness and beauty. However, like absent of that, like what are we to do, right? Because it's not like that kind of pragmatism just doesn't work in terms of making judgments in the here and now.
Right.
We don't have that kind of perspective.
Nope.
Right. And the other thing that's also, that's part of this is like the homosexuality question is perfectly clear if you ask the pragmatic evolutionary Darwin question. That's like almost too easy.
I know.
And, right. Well, what's more of an exhausted force than a homosexual couple that can't generate versus a heterosexual couple that can generate indefinitely into the future? Right.
True.
And how much is homosexuality a perfect symbol for an exhausted force?
Well, it's interesting when Peterson had his conversation with Dave Rubin. You could see how Peterson's pragmatic evolutionary side is sort of befuddled. It's like not quite sure what to do with this, right? And at the end, he kind of awkwardly said, "Well, I've had my reservations in the past, but like I know you, and you're a really nice guy, and I really like Douglas, so good for you, So he's like, it's the Ellen DeGeneres effect, like his inner liberal doesn't really have anything to say, and I mean, I guess you could say in a sense that that's also an example of the how like a purely pragmatist viewpoint can't like ground this sort of thing indefinitely, because it's like at the end he felt like he feels like he doesn't have anything to say substantively morally against it. It's just like, well, if there's a way that it could work in the future, like if Dave and his partner or whatever, well, I could sort of see it, so let's try it, let's experiment, let's see if something new can work. So that shows he doesn't really have a way to ground his ethic.
Yep. Hey, I do want to get to this last to one clip though.
Sure.
And we haven't yet gotten to. So yeah, I don't know what you were thinking of, but I was thinking I wanted to say something about the least, the reality being grounded by the least probable.
The least
thing.
possible.
Or least possible.
Let's go there first. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, sure.
I disagree with that. What Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it.
Least possible than the Big Bang, for example. I don't know. I see all scientists move towards something which is least possible, let's say.
As a precondition.
Yeah, of course. That's something that is impossible as a precondition for possibility.
What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not to diminish it, but having your cake and eating it thing, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen, and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself, but it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory. And maybe the contradiction is the point.
Well,
pause there. So this is Hume, okay? This is all over again, bottom of the beer mug, as my dad likes to say. Oh, look, it's David Hume. The thing that has never happened, the least likely thing, the least probable thing. Okay, so that's a very fair point to make in conversation with a guy like Jonathan, who is very deliberately eschewing any kind of evidential case, any kind of inference to the best explanation in a in a concrete sense with the resurrection, although he's still trying to kind of back into it. So, he's trying to do the Lewisian thing, by it, I see everything else, which is great as far as it goes. I think that's a fine argument. But then it needs to be complemented by and like rooted in that the resurrection is the best explanation of all the data we have around the Christian story, around the Gospels. And so if you're deliberately avoiding that, then it really does feel like, as Douglas says, like you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. But the good news is that Hume was wrong about everything, but specifically about this. He was also wrong
I like
about
some parts of Hume. I like him sometimes.
Well, okay, I will give him. I like some of the stuff that Jonathan Haidt uses. I like about like moral sense and taste buds. So that's all good. But he was wrong
and
about
also
this.
he was kind of a proto-Bayesian in some ways that are
I don't think so. I mean, I think like his well, that's a whole thing. I also think he was wrong about.
Well, he got corrected maybe into Bayesian style thinking. But the things that Hume is best on, he's least known on, and the things that he's most known on, he is the worst on.
I totally
so,
agree.
like, on miracles is one of the worst things
I know, but that's the thing that keeps coming up over and over again. And it's what I mean. Because earlier
goes to that, like
Shermer. Oh. Anyway,
I talked to Shermer once, and I was like, do you understand how Bayesian reasoning works? And
no, but he'll say, and this,
no, he doesn't.
I know,
Spoiler,
and he like, and Shermer like threw out words like probability or whatever in his talk with Peterson, and poor Jordan, who doesn't know how any of this works, just sort of meekly deferred to him, like, well, maybe you're right, that the probabilistic whatever. Like, no. Yeah. Michael's an idiot. He doesn't know anything. Don't listen to him. Anyway, but yeah, like this, it's just, there's a difference between the prior probability and the posterior probability. Like, okay, we could say that there's a low prior for something like a resurrection, because it is a rare event. That's why it was miraculous. We get back to the just how stupid was a first century Jew question, right? Why do you think this was a big deal? Why do you think they were shouting this from street corners and rooftops? But it's not necessarily going to cash out as the least possible or the least probable thing once you bring all the evidence into account. So that's what Douglas needed right there. He needed that, that punchback.
Well,
the
other thing is that, do you think that that's what he meant by also? Like, maybe the contradiction is the point.
Well, that's where he's talking about.
I think that Douglas had probably the best argument. That was a good argument against the pragmatic Darwinian Platonist version of Christianity.
Right.
Because what he's saying is, you either have to tell me that the resurrection was the obvious point of the whole thing, and that we basically should have been expecting and been like, oh, there it is, right on schedule, right? And been as surprised by it as the sunrise. Or you have to tell me that it was so surprising that it is the very surprisingness of it is proof that God was in action, basically. Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like you can have both of those things.
You can't be both. Yep.
Right. And I think that is actually a very good point. I think Jonathan made a very good point back, but Douglas was like, okay, I see that that's a good point back, but I also still want to finish what I think is my good point. And
but the Big Bang was a good point. Well, and I mean, I don't know how Jonathan is thinking about the Big Bang, but to me, the Big Bang, it's another IBE thing, another inference to the best explanation thing, and Lewis talks about that too, right? I mean, doesn't he say that the Big Bang is the greatest miracle, right? So if you already have that, the resurrection seems like small potatoes. Isn't that a miracle somewhere?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe Jonathan's even thinking of that. So I think that would have been fun to tease out more, but Doug was kind of irritated and wanting to finish his thought there.
I think there was also part of the point that stung a little bit.
I
think it does. Like Douglas, like he literally like kind of shook his head and that kind of stuff. Like he clearly like did not expect that retort. It was really good by Pageau.
Well, and I mean, I think how I would finesse it is I would say the Big Bang is the most likely thing, right? I mean, it's least likely if you're stuck in a Humean mentality, okay? If you're stuck in okay, I'm going to sound like Jonathan, a scientific materialist mentality, right? But if you've broken out of that, you're no longer a slave to that way of doing science, right? And you're willing to think outside of the box and think of God as a cause, right? Then it could actually be the most likely, the most probable. That doesn't sound as sexy as most impossible thing as precondition for possibility, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the actually epistemologically accurate way to frame it in the final analysis.
I think that what he was pointing out was it's an event that only happened once.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So
sure.
at any given moment, the Big Bang's not happening. Right. Like things aren't just like springing into existence all the time. Right. And so like in that sense, it's a very improbable event at any given moment. And yet we all believe that it happened.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, at Dawkins,
so like,
we'll talk about that too. It's like it's an amazing coincidence that we're all here, but now that doesn't happen anymore, right? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And so I think that like Pageau is rightly pointing out that like, okay, we have this event that we only happened once, and we have all this evidence that it happened, and we all believe that it happened, and we don't know why it's not happening all the time. But we believe that it's not happening all the time, and it only happened this one time, and what are we to do with that? And that's very analogous then to the resurrection in that sense. It's
the resurrection, like happened. The Big Bang and microcosm. It's like
right, and so like I think that, and so like maybe I wonder whether or not I think that like Douglas was kind of conceding the point that like maybe the contradiction is the point. It was meant to stand out. It was meant to contradict the world as we know it to exist. And so he's kind of conceding
all intelligibility grounds out in something weird and unintelligible. I think that was kind of Pageau's point, right? And that would be a very 5th century church father thing to say. Right, that one, the further up you go, the less intelligible it gets until you ground out at something that is, bizarrely contrary to what you can think about, right? And so I think that Pageau was basically saying the resurrection is kind of like one of those sorts of things.
You wind up at the Trinity, like.
Yeah, but to your point, Sam, that does like not jive with this kind of like deterministic, like pragmatic view of how we got to that point.
Yep. Yep.
Like this stands out. This is not something that you would predict, and we need a lot of evidence that it actually happened in order to believe that it actually did happen. And so, like in this kind of like pragmatic world where everything's leading to this, like that's not what we would expect. So that's I think that it was a retort to them, but like he was conceding something there that like maybe the point is that it stands out, and maybe actually your description of Christianity is actually not accurate in some ways, which is interesting that the atheist is correcting the Christian.
That happened kind of a few times here.
Yeah, it did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are a couple more clips that we could play. There's sort of the eternal in the finite. There is Pageau talking about sort of how the Enlightenment turned Christianity very proposition-y, right?
We sort of covered that earlier, I think.
Right,
somewhat.
And then there is some more talking where Pageau is sort of doing the inference the best explanation thing about a value neutral universe.
We kind of got to some of that earlier too, and he's doing he does sort of an argument from gratitude, which was a really nice section, I thought. And we don't have to like play the clip, but I mean I think we most remember how it goes, where basically it's the don't you want to thank someone argument. And it goes back to the cathedrals as well, that they're built, in this upward sloping way. And of course, like the Cave and the Light talks about the structure of cathedrals and how they're built in a way where it's like the very structure of the building is giving thanks. So that was a really nice point, I thought, by Jonathan. And I think of I think of the argument from gratitude as sort of cousin to the argument from desire, in some sense, a little bit, where it's a desire to thank someone, you know. And I think it's a good argument. There's something to it. It's similar to an argument that Peterson has made before as well.
Mm-hmm. And it ties in with worship well, right? Because Eucharist means thanksgiving in the Greek, right? And Pageau has done a really good job talking about how sacrifice is really the heart of worship, right? You know, you're giving something to God not to like make him less angry, but as, you know, just this overflowing abundance of thanks, right? Yeah, so I think
every good gift and every perfect gift comes from on high. You know, there's the scripture tying that together. So, I mean, it's where did all of this come from? What's the origin? You know, did this just come out of nowhere? It doesn't feel that way. It feels like a gift, you know?
Mm-hmm. And that's similar to the value neutral versus the value positive universe sort of stuff that they talk about too.
Yeah.
Well, to tie this back to what we were talking about earlier on, you know, they were debating, like, is there meaning? It's funny that, like, whenever you stop framing the question that way, to Peterson's point, like, they're all talking about all of these things as if they're meaningful. Right? Mm-hmm. They're talking about gratitude and love and that kind of stuff as if they really matter.
Yeah.
Like, they really matter. They're not trivial. The suffering that we go through is not trivial. The gratitude that we express isn't trivial. The love that we have for each other isn't trivial. Like, whether or not we matter to our friends and family, to Douglas's point, is not nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is where I actually think that Peterson has something to teach us in terms of, like, this kind of a debate, because, like, none of that is debatable.
Yep.
None of it is.
You can't have the conversation without it. Like, that's where it all starts.
To some extent, he's actually right. This is a stupid question of, is there meaning? The question isn't, is there meaning? We all know that there's meaning.
Yeah.
The question is that, like, how do we make sense of this meaning that we experience?
Well, and I've been thinking back to the discussion with William Wayne Craig, actually, because I was actually thinking about it around the thing I wrote about the Queen's funeral, because there was this bit there where Peterson was getting kind of upset and exercised because Craig was doing the sort of nihilist reductio of the, like, if there is no meaning, let's suppose, then you know, what will it matter, because in a million years none of this will be around, and et cetera, et cetera. So then when Peterson got back up, he was really exercised about this. It's like, what does it matter? What does it matter? Well, I mean, would you say that to a parent who's comforting his sick child? You know, like, this matters. Like, this matters right now. But then, I mean, in a way, funny enough, I think in a way Craig was making the point, although way less eloquently and more cerebrally, but the Rilke point, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? And so, you know, Craig is sort of jumping to the end of the tape and saying, well, the answer is going to be nope, if there's no meaning. You know.
No, I don't think Craig is wrong.
Right, exactly. I mean, but then I think where people like Craig need to sort of sit with Peterson more, which I think you're kind of saying, is to be like, acknowledge that you know, even somebody like Peterson who doesn't have all of the pieces is onto something that's not nothing, right? And how it, you know, you'll tell him, well, you know, it's not going to matter in the end, and if this isn't true, and they'll be like, well, I don't care, because I know that this is meaningful and true and good now, and that's worth fighting for, it's worth living for, and maybe even dying for. And it's like a noble defeat in the end, you know? So, like, you go to a funeral and there's beautiful music, and okay, I don't think that he's going to go on in the afterlife, but the song goes on, the music goes on, and maybe death will roll over us, but we were singing while it rolled over us, you know? And so that's all you've got, and that's about the best that humanism can do. It's the Dylan Thomas thing, right? Rage against the dying of the light. You know, do not go gentle into that good night. And that's where Peterson is at, I think. And there's something noble about that. There really is something noble in that.
It's like, Puddleglum, the Marshwiggle and
right,
Narnia,
right?
right?
Exactly.
It's like, I'm going to behave as if Aslan is real, even if, he's not. I'm going to act as if I'm going to behave like a Narnian, even if there is no Narnia, right? And so a lot of people are in that situation that I'm going to be I know this is meaningful. I know this is good. I'm going to behave this way, even if not. And our job is to make the case that actually Aslan is real. Actually, Narnia, you are in Narnia. That is a real thing. That's our job as Christian evangelists, is to do that for people, is to make that case and to make it apparent for them that that's what, that's the world that they're living in. But we don't need to convince them that Aslan is good or Narnia. They're in most people are in the Puddleglum situation. Most people know that there's meaning. They know that this matters. They know that. Our job is to make it real for them, is to give them the good news. This kind of the William Lane Craig style of convincing is it's philosophically sound. There's nothing wrong with what he's saying. I don't disagree with him.
But there's no poetry. We need more Larkin.
Yes.
We need more. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
I think part of Peterson's superpower is that when he's talking and when he's at his most charismatic public speaking performance, he is helping you feel and experience the very things that he's talking about, right? When he talks about meaning, he talks about it in such a compelling way that you're drawn along in a way that you're feeling what he's trying to say at the same time that he's saying it to you. And that makes it so much more convincing, whereas William Lane Craig doesn't have that particular superpower. But I think that some sort of Christian version of Jordan Peterson who can bring people the full 9 yards will need to be able to hook up those dots in a way that's as compelling as Peterson's able to do, but go even further. And Pageau is not untalented at that.
No.
And Pageau has had his successes, but it's not. Yeah. I don't know what the extra magic is, but it's not quite there.
I hate to say this because we were saying something about Arzim earlier, but Ravi Zacharias was pretty good at that. I hate it. I hate it, but it's there. It is. I mean, he was kind of a preacher. He had that sort of magnetism on stage where he could tell you a story and pull you in. And it's not like he was a great thinker or philosopher or whatever, but he had that kind of it factor. And we all know how that ended. And I don't think it's a good idea to try to replicate the Ravi effect either. And I don't know if anyone can really replicate the Jordan effect, because if you think about it, there's a certain communicative superpower there, but isn't part of the superpower also kind of bound up with the fact that Jordan hasn't arrived yet? It's part of the essence.
So maybe
of his
he's just
appeal.
the John the Baptist of someone who needs to come after him. A
lot of people have said that, right? He's the gateway drug, kind of to Christian curiosity. That is the way that people have described him, in the past. And I think there's some truth to that. I don't know. But I do think that the way that he approaches some of these topics, Christians could do, and do it successfully. Not everyone needs the William Lane Craig, analytic philosophy takedown of meaning and that kind of stuff. And not that we shouldn't do that, and not that that's a bad thing to do or, whatever, but I don't know that most people need that.
Why do you think Douglas reads my Substack every day? Not to brag, but that's what I'm trying to do in writing anyway. I can't really do the stage thing, but as a writer, that's what I try to do. I try to do.
But you can see it with Douglas. He reads your Substack. He loves T.S. Eliot. He quotes all these Christian poets. It's clear that he's longing for something. What I mean, there's a lot of things that he needs, but what he doesn't need is like William Lane Craig to explain to him that if God doesn't exist, that there's no meaning,
Right.
QED. Like, that's not what he's struggling with.
Douglas
Like,
could make that point more
Exactly.
eloquently than William.
totally.
I know,
Like,
right?
Douglas knows that.
Yeah. I don't know where we go from here. I mean that in both in terms of this conversation and in the larger thing that we're talking about.
Well, okay, I have an idea, and wait, we don't need to play the clip, but I did love the bit. It was a bit of an extra bit that didn't quite belong, but where Peterson was talking about the eternal in the finite.
I can get that pulled up.
Sure, yeah. Then I'm queuing up a Bible verse that's going to go with it.
When you love someone, I do believe that what you see in them is something like a glimpse of the eternal embedded in the finite. And we don't really understand the relationship between the finite and the eternal. And we certainly have the apprehension at times in our life that we're making contact with the eternal inside the finite. And we also see that as deeply revivifying. I think you get that in the face of beauty. You get that in the face of music. You get that in the face of love. And I'm loath to say that that's not the deepest reality. And because we don't understand the relationship between the finite and the infinite, we don't know how our actions echo in the eternal landscape. And I'm unwilling to think that the instincts that orient us towards our deepest sources of meaning, that intimate an immortality and an infinity beyond our apprehension, are erroneous because they orient us so well. I mean, the great cathedrals of Europe, they're oriented towards a time span that's outside the mere mortal. But there's something absolutely magnificent about that ambition. And this notion of a love that survives death is like, well, if you love your wife and you have children in that love, and that love propagates itself to an unspecified degree out into the world and into the future. And so we don't understand the relationship between the finite and the infinite, but I don't think we can reduce the infinite to the finite and dispense with it. And that seems to demoralize people completely.
Unbelievable.
Right.
I think that was Jordan's best moment.
That was
talk. That was
sure.
Jordan. That was pure good Jordan Peterson.
Pure straight no chaser Jordan. And I mean, I think this is where he's the teacher, right? He's the Ecclesiastes guy. And so here's my little I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. So there's the coming along. There's the to complement what Jordan is saying. There, he has set eternity in our hearts, the eternal in the finite. There you go, Jordan. There it is. It's in the Bible. Okay, So, yeah.
And that's also very Platonist. It's a very Platonist question to ask: what's the relationship between the infinite and the finite?
Well, he said right there that's the perfect clip for his Platonic pragmatism, right? Because he's like saying, I'm not so sure that this isn't the deepest reality.
Real thing. Right, exactly.
The most real thing. Mm-hmm. And then he says, because it orients us so well.
Yeah.
So he's talking about both of these things. Like that is what Jordan Peterson is doing. That's his outlook. He's not a pragmatist. He's a Platonic pragmatist. His
pragmatism is causing him to walk, butt backwards into Platonism.
Exactly. Right. He's like, well, what orients us? And then he's like, well, there's these things that seem to be eternal and ephemeral and not located in time and space or anything else like that, and kind of transcendental, and that's weird. So you navigate
by the stars for a reason. You don't navigate by the waves. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, this is what you need an Augustine to come along. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what he was doing with Plotinus and those guys, and the Cave of the Light talks about that too. But where he's like, okay, guys, you're almost there. Guess what? Have I got a show for you? We're gonna just put all this stuff together now.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think that like, an Augustinian like view of Christianity, if Peterson ends up like converting, like it'll be because of like something like an Augustinian view of what Christianity is, and someone needs to make that case for him. I just worry that,
or does he need a voice telling him to, open and read, right? Augustine got a voice.
That's what Douglas wants, right?
That's what Douglas wants.
Open and read Romans 1, Douglas, sorry.
But even Jordan Peterson, it's also interesting because he probably said, I don't know, in that clip like 10 different times, right?
Yeah.
I don't know the way that the finite touches the infinite. I don't know the extent to what our effects, our actions ripple out into eternity. I don't know what our glimpses into the infinite mean for us now, right? Like but what he's saying by this I don't know is he's breaking down the assumptions that would say we do know that there is nothing. Right.
Exactly.
And he's fighting that sort of scientific materialism with skepticism.
Exactly. And that's been his whole project, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And by opening up other ways of asking the questions and thinking about the things that throw doubt on people who would be too certain against Christianity. Right. And that really is what I think the work that he's done, but it's also that particular orientation that keeps him from going any further.
Well,
because he's not saying I know now.
Yeah,
he can only say I don't know, not that.
Right, and there's a question, does he even believe that we can know? Does he or does he is there some kind of like does he have some deep principled commitment to agnosticism, right? Where that like if once he chooses like Schrodinger's cat, like once he decides to jump into the Christian box, then does he feel like he's committed himself to dogma and thereby violated some deep code within himself?
Right.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I really sympathize with him with this because, like, if there's a sure way for you to get me to not say the thing that you want me to say is for me to, like, intimate that you want me to say it.
Yes.
Even if I completely agree with what you want me to say, like, I will.
Oh, well, I'm not going to say that thing now. Yep.
Yeah, there are no shibboleths. I do not shibboleth.
No, like, I like that is, like, I am that stubborn. And so, like, I think that, like, he has some of that in him, too, that he just doesn't want to be told what to think or what to say or what to do. And that goes back to like the Bill C-16 thing. Like his big thing is like, you do not have the right to tell me what to say.
Yeah. And now, of course, especially now that he's a rock star and a celebrity, it's like, everyone wanted a piece of Tiger Woods. Everyone wants a piece of Jordan Peterson. And he can feel like Christians need to be careful not to make Jordan Peterson feel like Christians want a piece of Jordan Peterson. That's a temptation that we've got to avoid if we're going to, the Christian evangelism thing is great, but got to approach it the right way.
Yeah. And it's kind of an orthogonal point, but one thing that I did want to bring up that, we haven't talked about, and Sam, you and I didn't get to talk about before, is, earlier, I think we have the clip of Douglas Murray talking about why don't you just believe?
Yeah, right, right. Well, we've got you in the corner now, so...
we've got you in the corner. So, like, he's saying, like, hey, I'm admitting that our culture that I love, our civilization that I love, all these things that I really value and I think are good and all this kind of things, we owe a deep gratitude to Christianity for. And he's like, yeah, I agree with that. And I think that I think he calls it risible, the idea that we don't owe that to Christianity. And so he's admitting all that. And so, like, he's like, well, now the Christians have me cornered. And he says, so, like, why don't you just believe?
Yeah. And, it's funny because I once read an interview. We haven't mentioned Tom Holland very much, but Tom is an important guy in these conversations too. Tom gave an interesting interview once where he was echoing that same difficulty, where it's not like you can just flip a switch and believe. Belief doesn't work that way. Funny enough, Tom makes the analogy to being gay. Like that you can't flip the switch and decide I'm not going to be gay anymore. It's a similar deal here. And Douglas said that in our conversation too. And I really sympathize with that, which is why he needs to be like wooed, in some sense. He needs to be persuaded.
Yeah. And so so I think that you have like some people on the one side saying, okay, well, because you agree that our religion is, pragmatically useful in some sense, therefore you should agree that it's true.
And
right?
That's not,
and so
it's funny because so I was just watching some of Peterson's conversation with Peter Kreft, which was nice. I liked it. Kreft is very succinct, but there's a bit where Peterson's talking about Pascal's wager, and I think he is actually improving on Pascal's wager, because I never liked Pascal's wager as like why don't you
Pascal's wager?
Like I don't hate like
I like Pascal's wager.
Oh God, I hate it.
That chapter.
No.
I mean, I think that Pascal has enough self-awareness to know the strengths and weaknesses of what he's trying to do there. But anyway.
Well, I mean, so when Peterson brings it up, he was talking about how you can do a sort of Petersonian version of Pascal's wager, like what do you have to lose by acting meaningfully in the here and now, or something like that. And he said you can dispense with the the eternal benefit that it might bring you or whatever. And I actually kind of agree with him that you should dispense with that, because I never thought it made sense to treat it as a believe just in case, because if you're right, you'll get saved, because that's not how believing and getting saved work. It's like, it's not a pragmatic thing, but you can make a Pascal's wager like argument in terms of like a benefit in the here and now. That's what Peterson's trying to do.
And even Pascal has a little bit of that, I would say, in his own. But anyway, I think another interesting thing that this connects to with Douglas is he had a comment that was really kind of quick just one time about religion being philosophy for the masses, right? And a gesture at that was sort of an elitist way of understanding the function of religion, and that's a slightly kinder way of like the Brett Weinstein metaphorical truth thing. Because it's like there's kind of truth for it, but it's in sort of a juvenile package, right? But we, the enlightened people, recognize the childishness of the religious wrappings, but then we cut our. But then does that cut off the branch that we're on from the tree that we need?
Well, and also here comes Sam Harris. Okay, so in that talk, I forget if it was I think it may even have been one of the ones that Douglas was moderating, but Sam had this sort of brutal little line to Peterson where he's like, so you're saying that that stupid people need it, but we don't need it. Is that what you're saying? And then Peterson kind of tried to dodge it by saying, "Well, we're all stupid, Sam." And Sam goes, "Well, we're not that stupid." It was really savage. But I think Sam was kind of trying to highlight the elitism there. And I think people could have misread it as Sam being elitist, but I think that was Sam.
Sam was making an anti-elitist.
Yes,
right.
I think that was Sam trying to be populist. And saying like, "Look, I'm gonna give the people the truth, right? I believe the people can handle the truth. Unlike you, And then Peterson's like, okay, fine, but you're going to kill them that way. People will die if they don't have. Well, and that's something that Jonathan was saying in this conversation, where he's like, you can't move without meaning. You can't live without meaning. And Douglas is like, I'm not disagreeing with you. I know. That's why I'm having a hard time here.
I've noticed.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my retort would be to that kind of like line of reasoning that Douglas was kind of like postulating, right? That this like religion is the philosophy for the masses that we like enlightened people don't need. I don't think he was advocating for it. He was just saying that that's one position you could take, right? The issue is that's only even a possibility if you can actually provide all of the things, even in your enlightened philosophy, right? Like if these other things are still missing that we need,
right? Sam
to
Harris
make sense
isn't going
of the world,
right? He's not going to replace any of that.
Yeah, and so you can say like, well, the enlightened, the masses will never understand why you can still have all of these meaning things. So we have to give you this useful fiction. You're like, okay, that kind of works if so long as your enlightened philosophy can provide all those things. I think what Douglas is saying is, your enlightened philosophy can't provide all of those things at all. And
that's what he means. Yeah, that's what he means at the beginning when he's giving his little origin story, and he says, so I was a late 20-something new atheist, and I thought that would be enough.
Right.
But it wasn't enough,
So he's like, I drank that I went to the bottom of the barrel there, and what I thought was there was not.
Right.
And so
and then he just had a temporary rush of the zeal of the convert.
Exactly, yeah, the zeal of the
said.
convert kind of thing. But like, this whole like that fiction that like religion is the philosophy of the masses and that they need it, but we, the elite, we can handle the truth and still get all of these other things. He's saying no, like we're going to end up just as nihilistic and depressed as anyone would without this story. And then the question is the story true?
Is it more true than Dostoevsky? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so that's where, so you have the one side where, you have the religious saying, well, since we've got you on the usefulness of our story, you just need to believe. And you're like, okay, well, no, that's not how belief works. But then you have the other side. But then you have the other side that I think is what Pageau and that ilk do, is that they want to redefine what believing means.
Right. Yeah.
And
I can't do that either.
No, you can't do that either. Like saying, well, did Jesus really? That's why like Douglas was pressing in. Did Jesus really come out of the grave?
Well, and
did this really happen?
Yeah, and there's a great bit, we didn't play this bit, but it's apt here, where Douglas says, look, let me just be totally honest to put my cards on the table. I would be fine if Jonathan's view was prevalent, and I never had to answer the question of whether I literally believe in the resurrection. I would be okay with that. But I can't dodge the question. We can't dodge the question because the West can't dodge the question, because the West is ultimately dependent on that question having a concrete answer. And that's the thing you have to come back to. It's like, okay, fine, maybe you don't literally believe it, but somebody has to somewhere. There has to still be people out there literally believing it, because they're the ones who are really ultimately keeping the lights on here.
And that's one of my dissatisfactions with Pageau, is that he does, I think that he would say, oh, Douglas, you're asking that in too post-enlightenment-y of a way, and the ancient people didn't think like this, right? And there's a clip, that is similar to that we could play, or, but where Pageau is like, I found my true home in the Orthodox Church, where I basically didn't need to confront that question that way anymore for me. And part of me is like, I don't think that this is just a weird post-enlightenment thing, right? And we were talking about that earlier.
The creed itself, I mean, my gosh, he talks about, well, we reduced it to a list of things to believe. I'm like, what do you think the Apostles' Creed is, if not a list of things I believe? I mean, that goes all the way back to right after Jesus' resurrection. So
this is the kind of picture that you only get if you're only reading like mystics before the Enlightenment. Like, I'm sorry,
right? If you think Saint Anthony of the Desert is like the only story in town. One thing that I was thinking of is, speaking of origin stories. So Origen, the 3rd century church father, heretic person, he has a
everyone's favorite heretic.
Everyone's favorite
Everyone's
radical
favorite
church father.
Yeah.
But one of the things I don't like about Origen, although he does this way better than the way we were just talking about, is he can be a little bit of an elitist, right? Where there's the true spiritual interpretation of Scripture, and the highest form of living is to understand the spiritual interpretation of Scripture. And some people are stuck at what we would call the literal or the historical level of Scripture, and then some people make it up to like sort of the application and general lessons from Scripture level, and then some people understand the spiritual level, which is basically sort of like Platonic archetypal truth level, right? Kind of. But for Origen, they all stack, right? And they are all mutually coherent together. Right. Yeah. And so when he says some people are stuck at sort of the literal level, that's a little bit of a criticism, but he's not saying they're wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? Nor is he saying they're deluded and I am undiluted. He is saying what they know is true, but they don't know how true it even is. Right? Whereas he's not saying religion or the literal level of the story is philosophy for the masses.
Which, by the way, I'm game for that interpretation. You can make the same criticism for or that kind of analysis. You can make that same description of like the Pharisees, right? They knew the law. Mm-hmm. They didn't know the deeper meaning.
But they didn't understand, right? And so,
right? And so you're like,
what
fine.
I'm saying is Origen's thing is much nicer because they all stack, and no matter which layer you're stuck at in the stack, you're still true. It's just that he would encourage you to go further up, right? Mm-hmm. But there isn't this discontinuity where there's philosophy for the masses disguised as these religious fairy tales that are getting you to do the right thing, but they're actually not true. Whereas me, the post-enlightened Douglas Murray person, understands they're not true and knows the real truth. Origen doesn't do that kind of antagonistic dichotomy.
Right.
For him, it's just a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's more Platonism. More Platonism and more hierarchy.
Eat more Platonism. Yeah.
That's really good, Sam. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the crux of the issue is that we can't force Douglas into believing, but then also like we can't change the definition of what it means to believe.
Right. And that, I mean, there's many ways in which that can be true. So, a guy like Jonathan, I mean, we've been giving him a hard time throughout for how he wants to change the definition in one sense. But other people will try to change what it means to believe in the sense of giving up some of elements of the Christian ethic or Christian orthodoxy, like we were discussing earlier, of the affirming churches or whatever, which is something that Jonathan is good on. So I want to give Jonathan credit for that. He's not going to try to dispense with the moral ethic, but some people will do that too. And so in that sense, they'll also say, oh, well, you could be gay, that's not an issue. You can have a partner or whatever and still believe it's okay. He's not going to buy that either, I don't think.
Yeah, well, and the thing is that, like, Jonathan, I mean, he did end up affirming the things that, we would want him to affirm, like, and even in this talk. So I don't want to, like, cast aspersions on him or anything else like that. I love Jonathan. I think he's really, I think he's, at some points, he's, like, super insightful. And and really good. I just think that, like, for reaching someone like Douglas, you're not going to get there by trying to say, like, let's just talk about story and metaphor and myth and that kind of stuff. Like, and he even recognized that in the talk. Like, I think I understand your question, Douglas.
Right.
Was the grave empty? And, he tried to kind of like talk around it a lot, but Douglas obviously was having none of that. Like, so, he's not interested in that. I think,
and I mean, this is where I think it was my mom who came up with this phrase. You need to connect the prose and the passion. You need a unified mind. You bring together the upper story and the lower story. Make it all make sense at the same time. And I think Peterson's project is a stepping stone on the way to that, like we've been developing here. I mean, in the sense that I think Platonism is a stepping stone to Christianity. So he's kind of holding that out as a key for Douglas. So, just got to keep going, play out the tape.
Yeah, I don't think. Go ahead, Tripp.
Well, I was going to say, I was just going to bring up something that, I can't remember where it is that Jonathan was talking, which talk it was. But he had a really great point, and I think that it informed my way of interpreting Jonathan in a way that makes me much more sympathetic to what I think he's trying to say, even though I'm not always, I don't always think that he does a great job of explaining it. But, he had one particular point where he was talking, I think it was with an atheist, but they were talking about how, or maybe it was a Christian, kind of interrogating him or trying to steel man an atheist argument. But what he was talking about was, listen, we all, whenever we view the world, whenever we examine things that happen, we all have to draw lines at what level of interrogation we're going to have and what levels of interpretability we're going to have. And so the higher level is not less real than the lower level. Just because you keep going lower doesn't mean that it's more real. And in fact, we all stop somewhere. So you could think about your liver. Is your liver real? Well, yeah. But it's made of cells. Those are lower level. So let's keep going down. Okay. Well, are your cells real? Well, yeah. But they're made of organelles. Are they real? Yeah. Molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, strings or quartz or whatever else you want to talk about. We can keep going down this chain, but every level of this entire chain is real. And so it's kind of similar to, Sam, what you were talking about with origin, is that they stack. They're all real up and down this chain. And so these higher levels, these higher patterns, these stories, these archetypes, those kind of things, they're real. And so we can keep, we're all drawing the line somewhere at what level we're willing to talk about the things that we're talking about. And I was like, that's actually a really good point, because we don't talk about these intermediate material things as if they're less real than the thing below them. And I was like, that's actually a really good point and a really interesting one. And I think that that's the way that he wants to talk about all of these things. It's not that this is metaphorical and this is real, but let's talk about the metaphor. I think he's talking about it as if it stacks, and all these levels are actually real. And
I agree with you there. Yeah, I see that as well. And so then I think my encouragement to Jonathan would be, different layers need to be more heavily emphasized for different audiences. So,
yep.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I don't know, actually, maybe I would somewhat take that back, because I think you need to emphasize the physical layer really heavily for all audiences, frankly, because you can't get away from it. But you especially need to emphasize it with people in Douglas's position. So it's not it's not that Jonathan doesn't have that, but it's just you need to speak up and you say it louder and push it forward.
I think that part of why why Pageau can't quite reach Douglas is that for Pageau, he kind of wanted to get back to a pre-Enlightenment Christianity and just sort of dodge the Enlightenment altogether as a question.
Right,
but I don't
and
think
he was
Douglas
able.
is.
And maybe a personality thing. It could be, it just the way his mind works. That Jonathan found a contentment. He was able to be content and reconcile himself with that. And Douglas is just a fundamentally more discontent personality. That it's he cannot go back. And then the challenge for somebody like me, because of course we all like to put ourselves forward. It's I'm the one who's really going to reach Douglas, right? It's well, okay, but I think the challenge I feel, and I've even felt this in corresponding some with Tom Holland, who's I also know somewhat, quote unquote, via email, is that there's certain deeply embedded post-Enlightenment assumptions that are really difficult to root out about. It's the little list that Douglas read off. Well, this happened and that happened and science happened and biblical criticism happened and whatever. And it's are you ever really going to be able to disabuse them of that? I'm not really sure. That's a tough challenge, because even if you lay out all the best arguments, are they going to be convinced by them? And not everyone is, and it's not your fault. It's just they're not willing to let go of that, especially if some of their professional pride is bound up with it. That's really difficult.
Yeah, and I think part of it for Douglas is that this isn't in a vacuum either, right? For Pageau's story is a little interesting, right? His grandparents, French-Canadian Catholics, his parents leave Catholicism to become, basically American evangelical Protestants at Wheaton due to some dissatisfaction, presumably, with Catholicism. He leaves American evangelical Protestantism and becomes Orthodox for various reasons that he was dissatisfied for it, right? There's this chain of discontinuities kind of for Jonathan, but I think for Douglas, he wants full-throated English, unashamedly English Anglican Christianity with the church playing its proper role in the whole vision of England that he wants going forward.
Yeah,
and that it's not just it's not just an individual cylinder that needs to fire for him as a person.
Right.
He wants to be drawn back to the church that's doing everything that he hopes the church would do for his country.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
he wants to be in deeper continuity with his own roots and past.
Yeah.
Right. And in a way that doesn't disacknowledge the Enlightenment as also being an English thing that was part of English history.
Very
too,
much so. Yeah.
Right. And I think Jonathan's okay with this sort of discontinuity thing because it's kind of in his personal story.
Yeah.
But I think Douglas wants, a
firing on all
relation,
cylinders. Yeah.
a cleaner relationship with his cultural context.
Yeah, he wants, and he needs a strong hierarchy. Right? Like he that's why he's so discouraged by the weak priests and the weak bishops. It's like we need, like he needs leadership. He needs people to look to who can be strong leaders. Where somebody, and maybe it is like an English versus American thing to some extent, like you're saying. Because I'm like, I never really had a pastor properly growing up. My priest wasn't particularly involved in our lives or lives of the congregation. He just gave us the Eucharist. And so I've always been deeply, intensely independent in that way. And so I can just be sort of perpetually, well, who cares if the priests and the bishops are all flaking out? I don't need them, I'm very...
Yeah, well, try being a heretic. You get that syndrome even worse.
Well, yeah, I know. But I feel like somebody like Douglas maybe has a harder time with that. Maybe he's like needs the hierarchy of priests around him.
Mm-hmm. And for the church to be in harmony with his politics and his country and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
He's as disappointed in the priests for the same reason he's disappointed in liberal politicians in England.
Yeah. Yep. And the priests sound just like the liberal politicians in England now. They all sound the same, and that's the tragedy.
And so that's a hard thing for Jonathan Pageau or Jordan Peterson to deliver in a single conversation.
Right. And somebody like me,
sure.
I was going to say, even though I don't have the same need that Douglas does, I think I can understand it better. Partly because even the way I was taught history when I was homeschooled, because my mom's PhD was in English literature. I was raised in an Anglican church. I was raised with the same liturgy that Douglas was raised with. And the way I learned history was very Anglo-centric. We really kind of learned history from the perspective of England. So I've been this Anglophile my whole life. I've loved the Anglican church my whole life, and English literature and everything. And so in a way, I'm a bit of a doppelganger for Douglas in all of this because, I grew up with it, but I never left it. And I feel like I can bring like the completely grounded, it's like a little bit of England was transplanted into me. And now I'm kind of like carrying it around like a little sapling, but I don't know that that's enough. Like I can offer it to Douglas, but I don't know if it'll be enough for him. But that's where I come in a little bit too.
I think one of the issues with Douglas too is that, and it's an issue with a lot of people, is that it's not so much I honestly think that like it's not.
Or to go back and replug the book Crisis of Doubt, because you're right in that that Victorian era that Douglas writes about in The Strange Death of Europe, where it's like, and then the great catastrophe, the great implosion, and biblical criticism, and whatever. And there's a whole untold story of all the people who actually came to faith during that time, because, like you're describing, Tripp, they actually looked at the arguments and they deconstructed their deconstruction, and we're like, wait a minute, these arguments all suck. They're terrible. How did I ever fall for this? Oh my gosh, I gotta go back on the lecture circuit and make amends now, and you had guys like Thomas Cooper who did that sort of thing,
Yeah, I mean, Hume admitted that his argument against miracles failed, like even in contemporarily, like that. Yeah, so like this is something that like what happened was they made these arguments, and then we repeated the story that these arguments. Even they
she got the same. She got the same.
She got the same. Okay, well, wait.
Am I sure?
Same thing. Yeah.
Yep. Same thing.
It might be the 3-hour mark. I bet.
Oh,
I bet
it's
your 3-hour anniversary after joining the webpit site or something like that.
Oh no, and my thing is like restarting, which probably means we should. Is this kind of recording like 2 pieces or something?
I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. Well, you can splice everything together.
I can splice everything together, and I was here the whole time. So,
awesome. Okay.
Although you guys were in the chat earlier than I was, so maybe mine is coming up in maybe you're gonna 2 minutes. All right.
Yeah. No. No. But what I was saying is like it's like they made these arguments, whether or not they worked, they got repeated as if they like debunked like. Christianity and these kind of things. And then like they just got repeated over and over. And so it's now people assume that, oh, well, now we know this about biblical, like the historicity of the Gospels. And now we know this about the arguments for God's existence. And now we know this, and now we know this, now we know this. But like no one does actually know these things. And
I know.
They couldn't adequately recount to you either the arguments for or against those positions, because no one actually reads them. They're just like, it's just a story that
it's a meme.
And the story has become more real than the truth in that sense in people's minds. And so like in some sense, I think that's actually Douglas's problem. I don't think that like we need to debunk the story for him. That's what happened. It's not so much presenting him with an argument for this, that, or the other thing. We need to debunk the story that this history was ever real. That
Isn't
versus
that of a
just
piece,
something
though?
that was repeated in universities.
I agree with that, but aren't those things sort of bound up with each other? Because to debunk the story of that Hume destroyed the argument for miracles, you have to show how Hume was wrong, which means, so I think those things go together inevitably.
But I think that it's necessary though to show that it was like not even true at the time that it was done, that this is a retroactive, this is a retconning of the history of these arguments, and not something that like, oh, Tripp Parker came up with this argument for why Hume was wrong.
No,
and you
George
need to
Campbell
believe
is doing it already.
Right, exactly. You show it was contemporarily like actually debunked, and this was a retconning of that whole history.
Exactly.
I think that would be much more effective for someone like Douglas, because then it also connects him with the history, which he cares so deeply about.
Well, that's where my dad comes in and his whole Templeton project, and that's where we come in with the old apologetics. It's like, I would give Douglas all of this stuff if he wanted it. If he just has to ask, he knows where to email me.
If you're still listening, Douglas,
you're still out there.
2 hours and 45 minutes out of some sort of narcissistic curiosity of what people say about you. I'm gonna write
a Substack. I'll write a Substack, which he will probably read, where I will put all this stuff in there, and I'll be able to spy and see if he opened the email. So I'll report back. But
All right.
this has been
Okay,
really
well, just
super
leave
helpful.
a link to my channel in there, just so that I
Sure,
can
I
get
will. For
some
people
clicks.
who feel like watching
All
3
right.
hours of us talk, I will also do that.
I'm fine
Thank
if
you.
they just watch the first couple minutes because that still shows up in my metrics. All right, I am getting the signal from my better half that it is time to come upstairs.
Okay.
So I
Thank
think that
you.
this
This has been
was
great.
really fun, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you guys for talking.
You're welcome. Been a blast. Thank you.
All right.
Take care.